Dota 2 is a wonderful game. Over the past year and a half, editor Tusky and I have been burning ourselves out to document the history of that wonderful game. History that was already being forgotten. Our goal was to create a repository that all of us could look back upon to remember. And by now, we believe this channel hosts enough information that if an attentive viewer watches each of the videos, they'll gain a thorough understanding of what Dota was. But still, we haven't covered everything, and we won't. This is the last Stories of Dota video. And unlike our other videos, today we're not going to discuss a specific hero. Instead, we're going to dive into the history of the game itself and deconstruct the changes that Dota 2 went through, the teams and heroes that defined it, and how all of this impacted our most important tournaments, the International. This will also be a bit more of a personal video. I hope that's okay. So, what was the story of Dota 2? This video is sponsored by boot.dev. Boot.dev is a fantastic platform for learning how to code. They've taken this huge, overwhelming task of becoming a back-end developer and broken it down into small, digestible pieces that are all learned individually while feeling like a fun game to play. You can complete quests, earn experience, level up, and compete for the leaderboard. Boot.dev resembles an RPG that teaches you how to code by coding. For this, they care a lot about getting you practical experience, as the only real way to learn programming is to actually program. The end goal is not just to teach you programming, but to get you fully prepared to work professionally as a programmer, which is frequently a very high-paying job. And on your way there, you can make some silly Dota 2 custom games, which we can then play together on my other channel. But the best part of boot.dev is that if you're still skeptical, you can just have a look at everything ahead of time, no questions asked. Boot.dev is incredibly transparent, as all of their content is free to preview without a membership, and memberships can easily be cancelled and refunded within 30 days. They are confident in their product and customer friendly. Go check out boot.dev. Their link is in the description of this video, and if you use the promo code Stories of Dota, you can get 25% off either a monthly or even an annual subscription. Again, the link is in the description, and the promo code for 25% off is Stories of Dota. Thank you very much to boot.dev for sponsoring this video. As I'm sure most of you already know, Dota 2 is a continuation of the Warcraft 3 mod, Defense of the Ancients, All-Stars. From my personal recollection, Dota 2 came at a needed time. Our story begins when Warcraft 3 had been out for around 6 years and was starting to feel old. Back then, game development was still significantly limited by hardware, which was progressing rapidly. Games were aging quickly because newer ones included features and visuals that hadn't been possible up to that point. Warcraft 3 was still solid, but there was also a definite desire for something newer. For many of us, Heroes of Newerth, which went into beta in April 2009, filled that initial void of a more modern Dota. But that game was plagued by a multitude of questionable decisions. A couple months later, League of Legends came around, and while it certainly attracted a large audience, League wasn't Dota. This isn't meant as criticism, but League was and is a very different game from Dota. For some, that was great, but for many players like me, it wasn't what we were looking for. We wanted Dota, but not limited by the Warcraft 3 engine. And then, in 2010, Valve announced Dota 2. Dota 2 was different from all the other Dota clones because it wasn't a fundamentally new game. Instead, Valve promised a standalone version of the original Dota All-Stars, made in cooperation with its developer, IceFrog. And Valve even went another huge step further. On the 1st of August 2011, Valve announced that not only would they show the game for the first time at the Gamescom 2 weeks later, but also that they would host a tournament there. The first International, where the winning team earned an unimaginable prize pool of $1 million. StarCraft 2 was the biggest esports game at the time, and its largest prize pool of the year was a meager $93,000 at the GSL Super Tournament. The prize pool of the International was so much higher than anything that we had ever seen in esports before it, that I remember some people genuinely not believing it. They just thought it was some sort of elaborate prank. But it wasn't. The prize pool was real, the International was happening, and the 16 best Dota teams had been invited to play. But despite all of the bravado, the actual location and setup of the event was fairly modest. It was a mid-sized booth, tucked away in one of the less popular halls with limited audience seating, and Valve offered bypassers t-shirts to come watch the games, as interest was tepid. But as the tournament progressed, the audience started finding itself, because two things became increasingly obvious. Everybody loved Na'Vi, and this Dota 2 game was pretty cool. The first International was an invite-only tournament. There was no way to qualify for it. Instead, Valve handpicked 16 teams to compete. However, they also only gave them access to the game a couple of weeks before the event. Dota 2 was still very much incomplete, feeling sluggish and being plagued with disconnection issues. According to Dendi, who played for Na'Vi, they found it very difficult to find other teams to practice against, as most of them continued playing Warcraft 3 Dota instead. These technical issues persisted during the tournament, as many games had players complaining about lag or experiencing disconnects. They also visibly lacked practice, as Dota 2 wasn't the same as Warcraft 3 Dota just yet, because at the time, Dota 2 had ported less than half of the heroes. This resulted in a metagame that was unique to the first International, a metagame dominated by the few heroes with strong disables that were already implemented: Earthshaker, Windranger, Vengeful Spirit, Beastmaster, and Tidehunter. Stuns were incredibly valuable, because they were the best way to protect your carry. During this era of Dota, there were only very limited resources available on the map, and the teams hadn't figured out yet how to optimize their economies. A very defensive single carry style was dominant, where both teams interacted little and focused primarily on farming, usually in a tri-lane. But there was another reason for this. Mana was incredibly scarce. Ring of Aquila hadn't been added yet, and the slow farming meta didn't afford supports enough gold for arcane boots. The best most supports could do was an occasional mana potion. Many heroes didn't even skill all of their abilities, because using them would have cost mana, which they didn't have, and skilling stats instead at least gave some benefit. Since spells were so limited, a fairly common and good strategy was to tank up, using cost-effective items like Vanguard or Hood of Defiance, and then win fights by outlasting the resources opponents had access to. This set up a perfect storm for one of the most dominant hero performances of all time. The best hero at the International one, without question, was Anti-Mage. Anti-Mage was a powerful late-game carry that had high magic resistance and burned his opponent's mana whenever he attacked. With just a Vanguard, he became nearly unkillable, and a single hit from him did drastic resource damage. Fights against Anti-Mage were a race against time, as he would eventually run any team out of mana and then left them prey to his allies. He was also one of the fastest farmers around, as his ability to blink was incredibly valuable on the old, restrictive Dota map. Anti-Mage was so overwhelmingly powerful that he was contested in 90% of the tournament and still had a 70% win rate. The best way to play against Anti-Mage was to ban him. A rule that Na'Vi stuck to religiously, banning him in every single game they played. I would like to tell you that the International one was a battleground of fierce competition, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. Some matches were definitely exciting, but the overall winner was quite clear from very early on. Na'Vi stomped everybody they played against. Their style of Dota was often different from what I described earlier. They liked being aggressive, challenging their opponents during the laning stage to build momentum and then leverage that into fast pushes and quick victories. Much of this was enabled by Puppy, who loved using Chen and Enigma to support his team from the jungle. Mention should also be given to Havost, who was unusually aggressive for a carry player, which forced Na'Vi to chase after and protect him. Na'Vi were one of the few teams that used Blink Dagger, which was risky because at the time, Blink Dagger had a 75 mana cost, and mana was really valuable. But it worked because their faster pace made mana less of an issue. Their aggressive approach to the game was also helped by the structure of the tournament, which consisted mostly of best-of-1 matches, meaning teams weren't given a chance to adapt. And so, Na'Vi destroyed the competition, losing only a single game across the entire tournament. And only because they thought it would be funny if they picked Pudge, one of the worst heroes around, in the grand finals. It was funny, and they even almost managed to win that match as well. Na'Vi were just much better than everybody else, and so they beat eHome and took home the first Aegis in style. Unfortunately, I can't recommend any games from TI1 for rewatch. This is mostly because of the awful production quality of that first tournament. The audio sounds like it was recorded in a jet engine. TI1 is a tournament that we should certainly cherish, as it kick-started our world of Dota 2. But I recommend we do so from a distance.
All I ever wanted was Dota 2 pizza. It's all I've ever wanted. The wait is killing me. I swear we are waiting, but oh Valve, why can't you see that all I ever wanted was my beta key?
Despite its many issues, the first international lit a fire in the Dota community. Everybody wanted to try the new game. Initially, most would find themselves disappointed, as Valve slow-rolled the release of beta keys. For what it's worth, as somebody who gained quick access to the game because I was at TI1, that slow release was justified. The initial version of Dota 2 was clunky and felt like you were always playing with significant delay. It was still very much an in-development game. But nonetheless, the demand was massive. And so, Valve slowly opened up the doors in a way that I think was pure genius. Dota 2 remained in a closed beta all the way up until its release a few years later. At first, the only way to get in was to fill out a Steam survey that asked about your hardware and experience with Warcraft 3 Dota, and then hope to receive a beta key. But as the game became more refined, Valve handed out additional keys to those who already had access to the game. Aspiring players quickly realized that the best way to get a Dota 2 beta key was to engage in the Dota community and request one from somebody who was already playing. Then, once somebody received their key, they also received additional ones from Valve to give away. Whole communities formed around gathering and sharing Dota 2 beta keys. It was very dynamic as it originated entirely from the player community. To get access to the game, you had to engage with its existing player base, which only made people want it even more. This system was incredibly successful. Around June 2012, Valve started selling an early access pass that included a beta key, and it was widely considered to be a waste of money because there were so many of them out there and the community was so dedicated to sharing them. By the time the International 2 came around, Dota 2 already averaged over 100,000 concurrent players. But let's not rush ahead. Another incredibly important thing happened during this time period. Valve implemented 44 new heroes. This completely changed how the game was played, as a vast new cast of characters became available. They also added 5 new items: Abyssal Blade, Heaven's Halberd, Ring of Aquila, Rod of Athos, and Tranquil Boots. By far the most important out of this batch was Ring of Aquila. Ring of Aquila was a cost-effective early game item that provided great stats and a helpful mana regeneration aura. From the moment of its implementation until its eventual removal, Ring of Aquila remained a cornerstone of the laning stage, as it enabled heroes to fight much earlier than they would otherwise have been able to. Like the first, the International 2 had a $1.6 million prize pool. But that's where the similarities ended. The International 2 was held in its own dedicated location in Seattle, with a proper stage, a range of casters and analysts, and an audience that came specifically for Dota 2. Its production set a new standard for what a Dota tournament could be. If you ever wondered why we never used TI1 audio, it's because it sounded like this.
Just ran out of it and got stunned once again. But he probably would have died anyway.
But TI2 was nice, modern and professional.
Leshrac, big semi-carry, can possibly be played as a real carry if you go and play it like Yamate likes to do.
The International 2 was still mostly an invite-based tournament. 14 out of the 16 teams were picked by Valve, and the remaining 2 spots were given out via 2 geographic qualifier tournaments that too were invite only. The structure of the tournament was also adjusted to have best of 2 groups and more best of 3 main event matches. Valve were experimenting with how to run an international. Still, the lower bracket remained a bloodbath of best of 1s. Within this bloodbath found itself a field of fierce competitors. Unlike the previous year, now everybody had taken the international seriously, practiced for it, and was here to win. Leading all of them were the Chinese teams, who were widely considered the best and favorites to take the tournament. IG and LGD in particular were looking incredibly strong, coming out of the group stages with only a single loss amongst them. Right behind them was the third Chinese powerhouse, Team DK. On the other hand, the previous champions Na'Vi were struggling, only barely making it to the winner's side of the main event. But they were already grizzled veterans and didn't seem particularly worried.
The international one was much more like a dream come true. The international 2 is a dream for somebody else to come true. We are just here to break them.
TI2 was played at a much higher skill level than TI1. It was incomparable. As far as I'm concerned, TI1 was a prototype, and TI2 was when competitive Dota 2 truly began. Unfortunately, the game wasn't very well balanced. Valve's priority had been to add as many heroes as quickly as possible, and while they certainly tried to balance the game, they didn't do a great job of it. The International 2 was arguably the least balanced of the entire series. 8 different heroes each had over a 90% contest rate, and out of the 90 hero cast, 57 were contested in less than 10% of games, with 24 going entirely unpicked and unbanned. A handful of heroes were just so much more powerful than everybody else that they completely determined how the game was played. Rubik was the most contested and successful hero of the tournament because he copied the spells of other overpowered characters. If the most contested hero of a tournament is a copy character, well then that's a sign of an unbalanced meta. Leading all those broken heroes in raw power was he who pushed and ended games before they even started. Lycan. Lycan was a summon-based brawler that became powerful incredibly quickly and could leverage his power into fast tower pushes, which then allowed his team to build momentum to either play for strong map control or just end the game right there. At the time, towers were worth a huge amount of gold, far more than any creeps on the map. This paved way to an all-in strategy that used tower bounties as its primary resource and willingly conceded creep farm on the map in favor of pushing. These teams often didn't have a late game plan and instead aimed to win before 30 minutes passed, as otherwise they would fall behind when their opponents caught up on tower kills. It wasn't unusual for these teams to earn a victory at 20 minutes or even earlier. Lycan spearheaded this style of aggressive pushing Dota. At least in theory. In practice, Lycan was banned most of the time, and Nature's Prophet took over his role. 4 out of the top 8 heroes were great at facilitating deadly pushes, and the remaining 4 were incredible against those kinds of teams. While you wouldn't see this kind of strategy in every game, the entire tournament still warped itself around it. The threat of any team trying to end the match that early forced everybody to play faster than they might have otherwise wanted to. Even setting that aside, Dota was much faster than during the previous year, as teams had gotten better at optimizing their farm, picking effective drafts, and using openings when they presented themselves. Tri-lanes were still the most popular approach, but a variety of different lane compositions were tried by many teams. And even tri-lanes played more aggressively than before, often going for early tower pushes to help gather some resources for their supports. Those additional resources also made mana less of an issue, which is only worth noting because of how much of a problem mana was at TI1. While the heroes weren't well balanced, the overall meta of TI2 was really fun and exciting, as a broad range of fundamentally different ideas were clashing against each other. Every team was playing towards different goals, with different limitations that they had to adhere to. This exciting meta was only made more exhilarating by the thrilling development of the bracket. In the upper bracket semifinals, Na'Vi managed to knock IG into the lower bracket, and then they did the same to LGD in the upper bracket finals. The top 4 of the tournament were IG, LGD, Team DK, and Na'Vi. Na'Vi were the West's sole representatives, standing with their unpredictable and aggressive gameplay against the strongest Chinese teams and their impeccable discipline and pursuit of perfection. The grand finals were Na'Vi versus IG. A difficult match for both teams, but IG ended up taking it, becoming the second champions of the International. It was a wonderful and exciting tournament that also showed just how much of a passion project Dota seemed to be for Valve. Gabe himself handed IG their edges. For what it's worth, I really enjoyed TI2, and I very much recommend the entire tournament for a rewatch. But to be more specific, Orange vs eHome in the lower bracket round 3 and Na'Vi vs IG game 2 of the grand finals are wonderful and showcase the spectrum of strategies that existed. Over the next year, Valve continued to focus on implementing new heroes at a rate of about 1 per month. There were also various well-deserved balance adjustments. Importantly among those, both Lycan and Nature's Prophet received significant nerfs, which moved the game away from those heavy pushing strategies. Also, on the 9th of July 2013, Dota 2 was officially released. Interestingly, it never went into an open beta, instead sticking with its community-centered key sharing approach all the way. Dota 2 received overwhelmingly positive reviews, although often accompanied with the caveat that the best way to play it was with a group of friends. Luckily, at the time that was quite achievable. Dota 2 was blowing up in popularity, adding 100,000 concurrent players to its player count every single month. By the time of the International Free, Dota 2 averaged over 500,000 concurrent players and showed no signs of slowing down. TI3 followed the same tournament format as before, however Valve made one important change to its price structure. In May of that year, Valve released the International 2013 Interactive Compendium. Players could purchase the compendium in the Dota 2 store for $10. It included a variety of prediction games for the International Free, and owners of the compendium immediately received some cosmetics, but could also get random drops while spectating TI3 matches. However, its most interesting feature was that the compendium functioned as a fundraiser for the International Free prize pool. 25% of all sales were added to the 1.6 million that Valve put up themselves. They even included stretch goals to incentivize more players to purchase the compendium. The final stretch goal was that the community would have been able to vote on the next hero to be added to Dota 2. Unfortunately, this goal was never reached. I would have really liked to see who the community would have chosen. Nonetheless, the compendium managed to increase the prize pool to nearly $2.9 million. Competing for this prize were yet again a set of invitees chosen by Valve. Amongst those were a couple of clear favorites. The Chinese teams were still looking incredibly powerful, and nobody in their right mind would be foolish enough to write off Na'Vi, since they managed to reach the finals for 2 years in a row. But the team that was by far the most intimidating was Alliance. Alliance were still a rather new team, having only found each other and their sponsor earlier this year. But it took no time for them to take over the scene, dominating the spring season. Then at TI3, Alliance went 14-0 during the group stage. They crushed their competition with a unique playstyle that focused on farming and defense. Alliance's signature heroes were Io, Nature's Prophet, and Lone Druid, all of which offered a global presence and allowed them to always fight with a numbers advantage. They stifled any early pushing and ganking attempts, then built a strong economy until they were far ahead, and finally finished the game in one overwhelming push. Most teams played momentum-based Dota, and Alliance was all about interrupting any plays that allowed momentum to be built. This completely shifted the metagame of the tournament, as teams both imitated and adapted to Alliance. Dota became slow and defensive. Building momentum wasn't worth it if all it did was create openings. And so, most teams focused on farming patiently to get their late-game carries online. The International 2013 was one of the 2 tournaments who featured a hero with a 100% contest rate. In this case, that was Batrider. Batrider was a more supportive character, although he was usually played in the solo offlane. What made him uniquely valuable was his ultimate, Flaming Lasso. Flaming Lasso allowed Batrider to literally grab an opponent and then drag them behind himself. With a blink dagger and a force staff, he could appear out of nowhere and literally kidnap the opposing carry. Batrider, being the number 1 hero of the tournament, was a clear indicator of the state of the meta. It was all about carries, it was all about late game, which was another thing that Alliance excelled at. They loved playing long matches, as they usually picked greedy heroes that could scale well, and they were one of the first teams to draft offlaners as cores instead of supports. Alliance made it to the grand finals without much struggle, only losing a single game along the way. In the meantime, Na'Vi had been having a rough tournament. Their first upper bracket match was against Orange Esports, a Malaysian team led by veteran player Mushi, but mostly consisting of tournament grinders that had only recently made their debut in the Tier 1 scene. Orange Esports was notorious for being an inconsistent team that put up widely varying results. To many, it was a surprise to see them make it into the upper bracket at all. It was an even bigger surprise when they beat Na'Vi in their first game, but it seemed like that was the wake-up call that Na'Vi needed. They hadn't been performing up to expectations, but after that first loss, Na'Vi stomped Orange and moved on to fight Tongfu. Tongfu was one of those infamous Chinese powerhouse teams, which showed as they brought Na'Vi to the brink of dropping into the lower bracket. In Game 3 of their series, Tongfu were in a dominant position, seemingly only moments away from a victory. But Na'Vi, in a stroke of mad genius, tried something never done before at a TI.
And now, charging back out, Dindy gonna be spotted, and he doomed to Chen. That's a much better choice. Oh, he got him! He got him! Not gonna follow it all the way, because we got a battle to watch with Puppy. Trying to get away from it, gonna be telekinesed back. And they will be able to get him as well. There you so a 1-for-1 trade. And wow, Hal is still alive down there. Finally, managing to bring him down, so that Aegis goes to no use.
Using a strategy that was widely considered to be a meme, Na'Vi managed to struggle their way to a historic victory, making it to the upper bracket finals, where they were promptly schooled by Alliance. They dropped into the lower bracket, ready to fight whichever Chinese monster had prevailed. Tongfu, IG, and Team DK were all competing in a ruthless lower bracket. But in a twist of fate, none of them succeeded. After their early loss, Orange Esports had been fighting their way through the lower bracket, beating Team Dignitas, Fnatic, Team DK, and Tongfu on their way back to Na'Vi. Their incredible run continued as they beat Na'Vi in Game 1 of the lower bracket finals. Game 2 was won by Na'Vi, but Orange then started overwhelming them in Game 3. They were so close to pulling off a miracle. But then, Na'Vi channeled some sort of divine energy, as their grand finals against Alliance was not to be taken. At 35 minutes, Orange killed Roshan, and then accidentally denied the Aegis.
We didn't realize at first. If I remember correctly, we were still playing the game for like 5 minutes. And like the pressure was getting to us too, and like a lot of like stuff's going on. At some point, I think it was Dandy, or maybe Hawas, It's like, oh, they don't have the ages. Like,
I think it took a few seconds for like the casters to realize as well, if I remember correctly. Like the crowd as well. Everybody was like, a few moments later, were like, oh.
That doesn't happen. I mean, who does that, and why didn't he pick the 8? You have so many questions always in this that, I mean, you kind of ruined the game. It's the feeling that you're left with.
There's footage of KYXY at that moment as his heart literally shatters.
За Данайла! ВР за Данайла!
ВР за Данайла Егес. Кто у нас там? Blood Angel?
Orange were still in a dominant position, but the magic was gone. And Na'Vi were the kind of team to relish this kind of situation. Using two of their signature heroes, Puck and Lifestealer, Na'Vi pushed their way to both an exhilarating and heartbreaking victory. While Batrider was the most contested hero of TI3, Lifestealer was right behind him and was the actual top performer. His incredible tenacity and ability to fight early, while also scaling powerfully into the late game, made him a safe pick who always performed well. Na'Vi's Lifestealer was so intimidating that Alliance banned him for all 5 of their Grand Finals games against Na'Vi. This Grand Final is, in my opinion, the greatest Grand Final in Dota history. Many expected it to be a stomp, with Alliance overwhelming Na'Vi in the same way they had during their previous match. And the first game very much went like that, with Na'Vi trying a hyper-aggressive ganking strat and getting shut out by Alliance's defense. But then, in Game 2, Na'Vi paced themselves slightly and managed to overwhelm Alliance. From then, it was a back-and-forth series, culminating in a wonderful Game 5 that is best enjoyed in its entirety. Alliance ended up taking the victory in a way that only they could have.
Oh, cancel TP! He canceled the beat from B! Puppy, he's not going to be back in the base!
He's got BKB, but no boots of travel. Coil on 2.
Cancels Dendy's TP as well! They are in huge trouble!
Funix caught! Now if they go for the throne, it could be game! Funix down! Alliance are doing it! They need a little more of those to fall! Throne in jeopardy! There's a glyph! It could be their last stand!
Dendy's back, he's going to try to focus everybody, but there's so much stuff hitting on the throne. There's no more glyph available. Down to a half HP, a quarter HP. Alliance surrounding from all sides.
BKB, they won this round. They're going to do it.
They're going to do it. Alliance wins. They win TI3.
The Alliance just won $1.4 million. They are your International 3 champions. They have taken home the first ever International for the Swedes.
The International 3 is probably the single most legendary Dota tournament of all time, and rightfully so. Orange's unbelievable run through the lower bracket, Na'Vi's fountain hooks against Tongfu, and Alliance's outrageous victory made for a perfect storm of narratives. But for what it's worth, I wouldn't recommend rewatching the rest of TI3, as the defensive, farming-centric nature of the meta makes for an unexciting viewing experience. 2 months later, patch 6.79 was released. 6.79 brought an important balance change, which slightly increased the value of tower bounties and slightly decreased the experience bounties of jungle creeps. It also marked the starting point from which Dota 2 was granted development priority over Dota All-Stars. Up to this point, Dota All-Stars would get patched first, and then Dota 2 would port over those changes. 6.79 was the first patch that was implemented directly into Dota 2, which was an exciting moment, because the whole point of Dota 2 had been to no longer be restricted by the Warcraft 3 engine. While this would still take a while to truly manifest, permission had now been granted, so to speak. In May of 2014, Valve released the International Compendium 2014. This compendium worked similarly to the one from before, offering some cosmetic rewards and access to various prediction games for purchasing it. Valve also continued to share 25% of their sales with the TI prize pool and offered various stretch goals. During the previous year, stretch goals had been a little bit awkward, because any given player couldn't contribute more than just the initial $10. The previous compendium limited spending, as players could only buy a single one for purpose. And so, the 2014 compendium fixed this by introducing compendium levels. Players could now earn and purchase additional levels for their compendium, which would reward them with a variety of different cosmetics. This started a craze in the community, with players competing over who could level up their compendium the most. And as a result, TI4's prize pool ballooned from Valve's initial $1.6 million to a total of nearly $11 million. The compendium continued evolving from here, sticking to this basic formula but continuously adding more and more rewards into it. It would also eventually become Dota 2's main source of monetization. Also, along the way, Lycan was buffed. Oh no! The International 4 was the first international to be held at the Key Arena in Seattle, which would become its home location. The Key Arena was quite large, with a seating capacity of over 17,000, which was appropriate now as Dota 2 kept increasing in popularity, regularly breaking 800,000 concurrent players. TI4 was still an invite-only tournament, but it opened up its doors much more than before. Only 11 teams were invited directly to the tournament. The remaining spots were given out to 5 out of 40 teams that were competing in 4 different invite-only regional qualifier tournaments. One spot was given to each of the winners of those regional qualifiers, and the final one to the winner of the newly added Phase 1 of the International 4. This year's International featured a new tournament system that saw it split into 4 distinct phases. Phase 1 was a mini-bracket composed of the runner-up teams from the 4 regional qualifiers. The winner from Phase 1 joined the other 15 teams for Phase 2. Phase 2 was a massive round-robin, where every team played every other team in a best-of-1. The top 2 performing teams from this round-robin immediately qualified for the main event upper bracket, while the bottom 6 teams were knocked out of the competition. The remaining 8 teams were then placed in Phase 3, a mini-bracket of sorts that first eliminated 2 more teams and allocated the rest into the upper and lower bracket of the main event. Finally, Phase 4 was the main event bracket where the remaining 8 teams competed for victory. If this seemed like a bit much, then yes, that's how everybody felt at the time, as this system was quite confusing and wouldn't be used again. Phase 2, the large round robin, was dominated by VG Gaming. This was a huge surprise, as VG Gaming didn't have an outstanding season before TI4. They usually placed in the 3rd to 5th range at Tier 1 tournaments and didn't win a single one of the competitions they participated in. VG were a strong team, but they also couldn't reasonably be considered favorites to win. Day 1 of Phase 2 went by without surprises, with VG winning 3 out of their 4 games, beating teams that they were expected to beat. Day 2 started with VG going up against LGD, a famous and well-respected team from their own region. LGD had already proven themselves, as they made their way to TI4 by winning their regional qualifier tournament. VG then proceeded to absolutely destroy LGD in only 17 minutes. This was highly unusual, but there were a lot of games going on and stranger things had happened before. VG then played 2 more regular games until their match against Newbie, which also ended in 17 minutes. This match was likely the single most fateful encounter in Dota history. On day 3, VG's game against Team DK lasted only 18 minutes. Then they lost the match against EG in 36 minutes, but won 2 more against Alliance in 14 and Team Liquid in 16 minutes each. Their final game of day 3 was against Cloud9, which they also tried to close out quickly, but Cloud9 managed to hold on and earned a 59-minute victory. VG Gaming were changing their playstyle as the tournament progressed. becoming increasingly more aggressive and centered around pushing. They took 2 more victories on day 4, securing their spot in the upper bracket of the TI4 main event. Let's wind back time for a moment to the beginning of Phase 2. Newbie, who, like VG Gaming, had been a lower-end Tier 1 team before this tournament, were performing okay. They liked playing aggressively but would often stumble before being able to close out their matches. Going into their game against VG Gaming, they stood at 4-4, and afterwards they were down 4-5. But after this match, an interesting shift happened. Newbie's next 3 games were all quick victories that lasted less than 30 minutes. Then they stumbled a bit, losing 3 more matches to close out Phase 2. Adapting their strategy like this gave them some good wins, but wasn't enough for Newbie to qualify for Phase 3. They had to play a 3-way tiebreaker with LGD Gaming and Mouse Sports first. If Newbie lost here, that would have been the end of it. They stuck to their new approach and continued playing quicker and quicker. They won the tiebreakers, but that only put them at the bottom of the bracket, meaning that in Phase 3, they had to win an elimination best-of-3 series to stay in the tournament and then 2 more to get to the upper bracket. Phase 3 was difficult for Newbie. They came to the brink of losing twice. But in this struggle, they refined their style, leaning heavily on powerful team-fighting ultimates to support aggressive pushing. After having played 10 additional games over VG Gaming, Newbie met them again in round 1 of the upper bracket and promptly destroyed them in only 14 minutes. Their next 2 games were also thoroughly defined by incredible aggression from both sides, but as they were more even, they took a bit longer to complete. In an incredible upset, Newbie ended up winning the series, then beat Evil Geniuses next and waited for their challengers in the grand finals. What made VG Gaming and then Newbie so different from everybody else was a unique, hyper-aggressive approach to pushing. Pushing strategies as a whole weren't unusual at the time. Lycan had returned to his rightful spot of utter dominance, closing out the tournament being contested in 98% of games with a 70% win rate. However, usually pushing strategies would play out like this. A team would push a tower and then retreat to heal up and farm for a moment to finish a few items. They would then push the next tower before retreating again. This was repeated at a rather frequent pace, which allowed the pushing team to build an incremental gold advantage and apply map pressure, limiting the farm of opposing carries. Eventually, usually at around 25 to 30 minutes, the pushing team would take barracks, which then resulted in a massive lane advantage that put a serious clock on the defending team. VG Gaming, however, played their pushing strategy without the breaks. Instead of retreating after a tower was broken, they would immediately rotate into the next lane and continue their assault. This was possible because they drafted resilient teams that relied on summons to sustain their health pool, and they prioritized cheaper, efficient items that could be purchased as the towers fell. When their opponents wanted to finish up laning at 12 to 15 minutes, VG were already knocking down their barracks. VG simply refused to let the other team play Dota. Newbie played similarly, but adapted the concept by centering it around big ultimates. Whenever these ultimates were available, they would break a building. If they went uncontested, they would continue pushing afterwards, and if that resulted in a fight, they would use their ultimates to overwhelm their opponents and then take a short break while waiting for their cooldowns. This approach wasn't quite as aggressive as VG's, but still much faster paced than what the other teams were used to. After their loss to Newbie, VG Gaming unexpectedly found themselves in the lower bracket. This was terrible news for everybody else down there. Cloud9 were the first to fall, then Team DK found themselves overwhelmed, and finally Evil Geniuses were knocked out with Game 1 and 3 lasting 16 and 15 minutes respectively. It was very clear that no other team stood the mildest chance against the hyper-aggression discovered by these 2 Chinese masterminds. Then the finals began, and VG brute forced a 24-minute victory in Game 1. However, as overwhelming as it was, their style wasn't unbeatable. The best reaction to it was similar aggression, pushing the other lanes while Vici were grouped up, and challenging them to fights whenever possible. In other words, Newbie's approach. The next 3 games were a brutal slaughter, with Newbie taking home the victory. All Grand Final games combined lasted a total of 83 minutes and 43 seconds, and this wasn't because of early concessions. When this approach to Dota fought itself, the games were just over that quickly, because neither team had the time needed to prepare a plan B. In Game 4, Vici tried to push for 15 minutes, and when that didn't work, they knew that there was no way to recover as they hadn't been farming. Newbie won the International 4, continuing the pattern of alternating TI champions between the West and China. Within the context of this rivalry, TI4 was an incredibly dominant victory. But that narrative was drowned out by a wave of vitriol. The community at large hated TI4, and especially the Grand Finals. They dubbed it Death Ball meta and declared it the worst international. Personally, I disagree with this. While quite a few TI4 games were short, there was a lot happening within that short time frame. And not every Death Ball game was over that quickly. Many of them were quite exciting back and forth matches in which every tiny moment was crucially important. I think time has judged the International 4 too harshly, and if you're so inclined, I would recommend rewatching the main bracket. It's rather short anyways. Specifically though, I would recommend rewatching the lower bracket finals between Evil Geniuses and VG Gaming, as it showcased how these pushing strategies worked, but also what could be done against them, which made it a quite exciting series. It's an interesting and fun experience from a very different era of Dota. An era of Dota that we left behind. In September 2014, patch 6.82 was released. 6.82 fundamentally reworked how Dota's economy was structured. Towers had their bounties significantly reduced, while hero bounties were buffed to now be much higher and scale more aggressively throughout the game. This scaling included a comeback mechanic that allowed teams to recover if they managed to get a kill while they were far behind. Before 6.82, turning a losing game around was incredibly difficult, often simply impossible. Even a kill on the most farmed enemy carry only netted a small bit more gold than a kill on anybody else. However, after the comeback mechanics were implemented, such a kill could make a huge impact, and a one teamfight could swing an entire game around. One of the many reasons why pushing was so strong as a strategy was that losing a couple of heroes while taking enemy towers wasn't a big problem. But now that attitude had to change drastically, as such losses would completely invalidate the gold earned from the tower kill. 6.82 also introduced bounty runes, which spawned wherever the regular rune didn't and provided the hero that picked it up with a nice bit of gold and experience. This was particularly impactful for supports, who wouldn't normally have the time or opportunity to farm creeps. But picking up a bounty rune was quick and didn't obstruct anybody else. Supports wouldn't always get the chance to pick up bounty runes, as the mids might want it for themselves, but when they did, they benefited greatly. I consider 6.82 to be the single most important patch in Dota 2's history, and to be the end point of the first era of Dota 2. Before this patch, Dota 2's primary concern was porting over Dota All-Stars from Warcraft 3. The game received regular balance patches, but that was it. There were no big mechanical reworks or new additions that weren't just ports of existing elements. 6.82 was the first patch that fundamentally changed the game, removing the most impactful strategy from the previous 4 years and pushing Dota into an entirely new direction. A direction that still defines Dota to this very day. I could envision a world where 6.82 had moved Dota a different way, maybe embracing hyper-aggressive pushing instead of removing it. If that had happened, the Dota of today would be unrecognizable. I understand that this is mostly empty conjecture, but I'm just trying to communicate how important 6.82 was. Valve has released many huge patches over the years, but none of them changed Dota in the same way that 6.82 did, because 6.82 reworked the very core of the game, and everything that came afterwards was built upon that new foundation. The first version of this new Dota was, to be frank, a mess. The comeback mechanics were way overtuned, resulting in a short-lived meta where pub teams drafted exclusively late-game heroes and then played for a lucky kill, which would get them all the farm they needed. This was adjusted across the next couple of minor patches. Then, in April, 6.84 was released. Like 6.82, 6.84 was a historic patch because it was the first that introduced a large number of new items to Dota 2. If you're old like me, then this is the batch of items that will forever be stuck in your brain as new items, even though it's been nearly a decade since they were added. This first set of items was quite interesting because they broke many of the existing expectations for what items should be. For example, late-game items were generally reserved for attack-based carries with only a few minor exceptions, but 6.82 introduced Guardian Grease, Lotus Orb, Octarine Core, and Solar Crest, all of which were quite expensive but didn't have much purpose for attack-based heroes. Much the opposite, as they benefited supports and casters. Supports in particular also received Glimmer Cape, and Observer and Sentry Wards now occupied the same inventory spot. The message was clear. Valve wanted to lessen the cruel burden placed upon supports. Before this point, supports would sacrifice everything they had to enable their carries. It wasn't unusual for them to end the game with literally just brown boots as their only item. But there was definitely a lot of skill involved to navigating late-game fights with such a limited inventory. Many players simply didn't enjoy how any small misstep resulted in their immediate death. In 6.82, supports received money, and in 6.84, items worth buying. 6.84 also included another unique item, Moonshard. Moonshard was a somewhat expensive item that provided a massive amount of attack speed. What made it interesting was that Moonshard could be consumed, which turned it into a passive permanent buff that increased attack speed by a lesser but still significant amount. This was a blatant, unapologetic piece of late-game power creep. Once your inventory was filled up, you could now also fit a Moonshard, something that simply wasn't possible before. Please don't understand this as me saying that Moonshard was a bad addition. I am using power creep as a neutral term. I don't mean to pass judgment. Power creep can be a very positive design choice, as sometimes games are more enjoyable if they are played at a higher power level. But it's interesting that this item was added at all. During the previous years, fully filling up an inventory was quite rare. This was an element of power creep that was mostly irrelevant, which was a bit strange. I believe that Moonshard wasn't intended to be immediately impactful on the larger metagame, and instead it was Valve experimenting with the general feel of a higher power level Dota. Later that year, in June 2015, something a bit surprising happened. Dota went back into beta as Dota 2 Reborn was released. For Reborn, Valve had ported the game to the Source 2 engine, completely reworking the main menu UI and everything surrounding it. While the core game stayed mostly untouched, this was still a very important and large step for Valve to take. It signaled their ongoing commitment to the Dota community and showed that they were willing to invest significant resources into future-proofing the game. Also released in June was patch 6.83D. Not for Dota 2, but for Warcraft 3 Dota. Warcraft 3 Dota never got 6.84 in an official capacity, and 6.83D was the last official patch that it ever received. However, Warcraft 3 Dota is a game for and by the people, and while it didn't receive official support anymore, it continued to be updated and maintained by the community. You can still play it to this day on a relatively recent patch. The International 5 was a fundamentally different tournament to what came before it. Only 10 teams received direct invites, and for the first time, there was a way for teams to fight their way through an open qualifier to make their way to the International. But this was a difficult road. Open qualifier teams had to first win their respective open qualifier, which gave them access to their regional qualifier, which consisted of 9 other invite-only teams. Winning one of those 4 regional qualifiers then properly qualified a team for the international. Unfortunately, not a single open qualifier team managed to make it all the way. Now I'm sure you're paying attention and notice that there are still 2 spots remaining to get to the 16 teams. Those final 2 were filled through the wildcard qualifier, which was a tiny double elimination tournament consisting of the 4 runner-up teams of the regional qualifiers. The top 2 teams from the wildcard qualifier also made it to the International 5. Those 2 teams who just barely made it in were CDEC Gaming and MVP Phoenix. Once past the qualifiers, TI5 introduced the group stages and bracket system that would become the standard going forward. 16 teams were split into 2 groups where every team played every other team in a best of 2. The top 4 of each group were then placed in the upper bracket of the main event, while the bottom 4 had to contend in a cruel best of 1 elimination game in the lower bracket. Every other main event series was a best of 3, except for the grand finals, which were best of 5. The meta of the International 5 was unrecognizable from the previous years. With towers being worth so much less, teams had to find a different way to build an early lead, which they did by creating their own towers. Stacking the jungle early and frequently became the dominant farming strategy, and teams were drafted around that in a way that was unique to TI5. Many teams had what I like to call a jungle support. Jungle supports were heroes whose whole job it was to stack creep camps in the jungle and then protect those creep camps from opposing heroes. They would occasionally show up in a lane or help with ganks, but their priority was to ensure their team's jungle was ready for harvest, giving their team a gold boost like towers did in the past. Teams also drafted powerful AoE heroes like Lashak, Gyrocopter and Queen of Pain as their carries and mid laners. These characters could take down the stacked camps early and then use that momentum to start applying pressure by roaming through enemy territory, threatening to take the opponent's stacks and gank their carries. Dota was no longer focused on fighting for towers, but instead players competed for hero kills and creep control. This shift completely changed which heroes were good and which ones weren't. Lycan, who had been an overwhelmingly dominant force, vanished almost completely, and characters who had previously been considered unusable, like Lina and Tusk, took his place. A new game required new balance, and in that regard, Valve stumbled again. Many heroes went uncontested or had very low pick rates, while a small cast were clearly and obviously outperforming them. The International 5 was the only international where 2 heroes had a 100% contest rate. The first of those 2 was Leshrac, who was simply a balancing mistake. There was no trick to playing Leshrac, he was just much stronger than he should have been in many different ways, but most notably in his laning prowess. Besting Leshrac in lane was just not possible. Leshrac was so broken that he basically didn't exist, as he was permanently banned. The second 100% king was Gyrocopter, a carry that was seemingly tailor-made for the specific environment of the International 5. He became able to fight incredibly quickly, specialized in massive AoEs that killed jungle camps instantly, and could utilize a broad selection of different items, letting him tailor his build to his team's needs. Gyrocopter was played by all teams and always performed excellently. While Leshrac was undeniably the stronger hero, that also meant that he was basically never actually picked. But Gyrocopter saw a ton of play, being the second most picked hero on top of being the number 1 most contested one, and he still came out of it with a nearly 60% win rate. Gyrocopter's performance at TI5 was one of the greatest of all time and a serious contender for the top spot. Evil Geniuses were among the favorites to take the International 5. They were a team made up of both seasoned veterans and impressive new blood, and had performed excellently in the year leading up to it. At TI5, they comfortably placed first in their group and made their way to the upper bracket finals without much resistance. Their path to victory seemed set in stone. In many ways, CDEC Gaming were the opposites of EG. They had little Tier 1 tournament success before the International 5 and only barely made it in through the wildcard qualifier. But there couldn't have been a more appropriate way for CDAG to join. Where EG were calm and calculated, CDAG breathed aggression. Their carry player literally wore aggressive as his name and did so for purpose. While our carries played defensively and focused on farming, aggressive charged in first. This was incredibly unusual. CDAG's main carry leading the assault forced their opponents to engage in fights with them, as otherwise aggressive would start snowballing a massive advantage by freely taking jungle camps from both sides. CDAG was especially different from other aggressive teams because they used normal late-game carries for it. Aggressive wouldn't pick Razor and then charge in, that wouldn't have been unusual. He did it with Phantom Lancer. This meant that CDAG could build early momentum and then played for the late game anyways, making for a surprisingly resilient strategy. When it worked, CDAG could put themselves into winning positions very quickly, and then carried this advantage through both short and long games. But this strategy had one major issue. If the opposing team managed to hold off the attack or simply didn't give any openings, like EG didn't when they first played against CDAG in the group stage, then Aggressive would be wasting valuable farming time and find himself far behind. Both EG and CDAG performed excellently during groups, placing first and second respectively. But when they fought each other, EG comfortably took the victory by limiting CDAG's space on the map using techies of all heroes. In the main event then, the two teams were seated on opposing sides of the upper bracket. Evil Geniuses played good and honest Dota on their way to the upper bracket finals, where they met CDAG again, who had been ruthlessly charging at their opponents until they broke. Everybody expected EG to win, and CDAG proved them all wrong. This unheard of team that only barely even made it to the tournament just beat the favorites and had secured their position in the grand finals. Evil Geniuses then won the lower bracket finals and returned for yet another rematch. But this grand finals was very strange. As we discussed before, Leshrac was overpowered. This may seem like I'm simplifying, but it really was that straightforward. The hero should never have existed in the state that he did. Leshrac was banned in nearly 90% of all games, and so it really wasn't unusual for a team to never pick him. EG had only gotten access to him once, while CDAG had never chosen Leshrac. And so it was incredibly surprising when in the grand finals, CDAG had first pick and EG didn't ban Leshrac. CDAG immediately chose him and then proceeded to do nothing with the strongest hero in the game, failing to build momentum and losing game 1 swiftly. It was then that the public became aware of the discovery that EG had made before the grand finals. CDAG hadn't just banned Leshrac in every game because he was overpowered, but also because nobody on their team had ever practiced the hero. CDAG had shown up to the International with no plan on how to play Leshrac, relying on the hero getting banned in all of their matches. This included relying on their opponents to ban Leshrac when CDAG had first pick. And up to this point, that had gone entirely unnoticed. But now, by refusing to ban Leshrac, EG had put them into a horrible spot. CDAG couldn't allow EG to pick the hero, but they also didn't have enough bans to get rid of Leshrac, Naga Siren and Techies, all of which had to go if CDAG wanted to play aggressively. And so, they had to pick him as a pseudo ban. This brilliant adaptation from EG crushed all hopes that CDAG had at winning, and so Evil Geniuses took home a well-deserved victory, becoming the champions of the 5th International. Personally, I think TI5 had a brilliant storyline, as EG and CDAG put on wonderful performances, but the lackluster balance and still confused nature of the meta makes it not the best for a full rewatch. If I had to recommend games from this tournament, I would actually recommend some of the techiest games from EG, like EG vs eHome Game 2 during the upper bracket, as they showcase the hero that we have since lost. After TI5, two major patches were released. 6.86 added Arc Warden, a handful of new items, and reworked the Dota map to be more open and accessible, while also adding a new creep cam. Among these new items, the most important by far was Iron Talon. Iron Talon was a cheap early game item that had an active effect that did a large amount of damage to a creep. By using Iron Talon, many heroes could clear jungle camps much earlier in the game than they would have otherwise been able to. A large selection of characters even became able to jungle from level 1. TI5 was all about jungle stacks, because in a way, stacking a camp was the same as killing it. That amount of gold was still earned, just with a delay. But now those stacks were much more difficult to kill, and all heroes could take on creep camps earlier in the game. This moved the meta away from jungle supports. The bounty of lane creeps also started scaling with game time, making them more valuable in longer matches, and jungle creeps gained a set of stacking auras that made clearing large jungle camps significantly more difficult. In March of 2016 then, Dota 2 reached its highest ever player count of nearly 1.3 million concurrent players. What I think was really cool about this moment was that it didn't happen because of some big event, or an incentive that Valve offered for trying the game, or because a new patch was released. No, there was nothing going on. Dota 2 earned that incredible player number purely because people wanted to play it. It was a moment of mundane triumph. It happened completely naturally, and just like that, everybody wanted to play Dota. 6.87 then continued the map rework to yet again ease movement between lanes, and boosted the bounty scaling of lane creeps, as well as adding another set of new items. The most important ones were Hurricane Pike and Bloodthorn. Hurricane Pike because it enabled Drow Ranger, who then became an era-defining carry, and Bloodthorn because of what it represented. Shortly before TI6, Valve released the Compendium for this year. Except, it wasn't called a Compendium anymore. They rebranded it to the International 6 Battle Pass, which featured a huge collection of quests and rewards that players could pursue through gameplay and purchases. For us today, explaining what a Battle Pass is feels pointless. But it wasn't at the time, because from what I can tell, this was the first Battle Pass. Valve invented the modern Battle Pass in Dota 2. As you already know, Battle Passes were incredibly successful across all kinds of different games in the industry, and they were here as well, pushing the prize pool for TI6 to over $20 million. At the International 6, teams became incredibly good at farming. Iron Talon, the reworked map, and the increased creep bounties resulted in carries getting gold quicker and more efficiently than ever before. And this eventually led to a very strange problem. Heroes ended up having too much gold. In quite a few games, they would find themselves 6-slotted long before the match actually ended. This is why Bloodthorn was important. Bloodthorn was an expensive upgrade for Orchid, which gave it a similar niche to Moonshard, as a super late game item that mostly existed to increase the maximum net worth heroes could use. 6.86 and 6.87 had introduced more resources to Dota, a pattern that was sure to continue. But those resources only made sense if players could actually spend them, and at TI6 that wasn't always the case. The International 2016 continued the trend of putting heavier emphasis on qualifiers rather than direct invites for participating teams. Only 6 teams were invited, the rest had to fight their way through their respective regional qualifiers or the wildcard qualifier. Many established teams returned, but the openness of this TI also brought in a lot of new names. Evil Geniuses, Na'Vi and Alliance all came back to take another shot at the edges. OG and Wings Gaming, newer teams who had dominated the season leading into TI, also arrived to show what they could do on the biggest stage. They were joined by smaller, less prominent teams like TNC Pro Team, Digital Chaos and Escape Gaming. The group stage went more or less as expected, with one notable exception. Digital Chaos somehow placed second in their group. This was a huge surprise for everybody. Digital Chaos was not a team that was anticipated to do well. They had strong players, but they hadn't had any Tier 1 tournament success before now. Most everybody would never have expected DC to make it into the upper bracket, but here they were. Unfortunately for them, their first opponents were Wings Gaming. Wings were a strange team. Despite being a newly formed upstart team from China, it didn't feel like they were taking the tournament seriously. They drafted Pudge in their second game of the group stage, playing against the reigning champions EG. Pudge was an unplayably bad hero. There was no reason to pick him other than to flex on your opponents. They lost this game, but still only barely. In their other matches, they displayed an incredible range of hero variety, and they seemed unbothered by their losses against teams that they were expected to beat, as it appeared like they were using those matches as testing grounds for new heroes and strategies. Then, in the upper bracket, they went up against DC and confidently beat them in Game 1. For Game 2, Wings then last picked Pudge and Techies, likely the two worst heroes in the game, against a draft that was already stacked with counters to them. They got destroyed, but again, Wings didn't seem to care in the slightest as they proceeded to stomp DC in Game 3. Every other team was here to compete on the biggest stage that Dota had ever seen, but Wings were just playing matchmaking. They then 2-0'd MVP Phoenix and Evil Geniuses to reach the grand finals without even the slightest difficulties. The metagame of TI6 was quite similar to the one from the previous year. I generally consider TI5 and TI6 to be a bit of a package deal. While there was less of an emphasis on stacking and jungle supports, both those elements still existed and saw frequent use. But they also evolved as simply playing dual mid lanes became quite common. This still gave the mid support plenty of time to stack, but also allowed less immediately powerful heroes to play the mid. TI6 felt like the teams had now figured out how to play post 6.82 Dota. They focused on incremental, smaller advantages as opposed to huge flashy pushes or massive stacks. Those came when a team had reached their perceived timing of opportunity, which varied widely for each different composition. In modern Dota, every hero scales well into the late game, but that wasn't true back then. Early and late game strength varied significantly, which led to a wonderful pattern of clashing ideas as teams competed to find and use their own best moments. The tournament was also remarkably better in its balance when compared to TI5, as a large range of characters were competitively viable. There are a few heroes that I would like to highlight. TI6 was the first time that Huskar and Ricky saw tournament play, as both had received helpful reworks in the year prior. Huskar took on the expected mid role, while Ricky was actually primarily played as a support. And then of course, there was Mirana, who was using her new Aghanim scepter to dominate the scene. At the time, Mirana's Aghanim scepter gave Starfall a passive trigger, casting the spell automatically whenever enemies were near her. This trigger had a cooldown, but this cooldown wasn't shared with the regular cast of the ability, allowing Mirana to effectively cast Starfall twice in a row. Starfall was already a high damage spell. Hitting an enemy hero with it twice, in particular when also connecting with the sweet spot bonus damage twice, allowed Mirana to get kills incredibly easily. 2 Starfalls also quickly cleared a creep wave, making Mirana exceptionally good at farming. With only an Aghanim scepter, Mirana became an incredibly threatening presence that could do everything her team needed, as she could adapt the rest of her item build to the situation. Sometimes she played as a right-click carry, while in other games she focused on utility with Hex and E-Blade. But her most common and most threatening style was centered around Dagon 5. Remember the issue I mentioned earlier? At TI6, the super late game item choices were a bit limited. Mirana farmed so quickly that it wasn't possible for her to spend all of her money in late game scenarios. And so, players purchased Dagon 5, the most expensive item in the game, purely because it was so expensive. Dagon 5 was powerful, but generally wasn't considered a good item because it wasn't cost-effective. But if cost-effectiveness wasn't important, then it suddenly became very dangerous. Dagon Mirana could hit an opponent with her arrow and then follow up with double Starstorm in Dagon 5 to instantly kill them. This then started propagating to other heroes. One of my favorite matches of all time is EG vs eHome Upper Bracket Round 2 Game 1 at TI6, as it featured a total of 4 Dagons, becoming incredibly silly towards the end of it. I highly recommend rewatching this game, although I would fast forward through some farming periods as it's very long. After getting demolished by Wings, Digital Chaos found themselves in the lower bracket. In an unbelievable turn of events, they were joined by OG, who had lost against MVP Phoenix in the upper bracket. OG, who had been one of the top teams of the season and this tournament so far. For many, they were favorites to win. And now, they found themselves in the lower bracket, going up against TNC Pro Team, only one step removed from Digital Chaos. This was obviously worrying for DC, as OG was a threat much too dangerous for this early in the lower bracket. And nobody had hopes for TNC. TNC were a solid team from the Philippines, actually the first team from the Philippines to even make it to TI. But Solid doesn't win. Their group stage performance was slightly better than expected, but it also wasn't good. So when they somehow managed to win Game 1 against OG, the world stood still. And when they were pushing the unimaginable in Game 2, the very idea of silence disappeared for a moment. I apologize, this is going to be loud, but the Pinoys earned it.
Matehan. Oh, Pia Mali, Ma'am Cornish. Ay, kala mo talaga! Kala mo talaga, Papi! Papi Chulo! Oh, yeah! Sabi mo! Oh, this is it! The boy is doing it! Di ba? Oh, it's over! It's over! Nako mo! Nag-divide daw si Miracle! Divide daw! It's over! Oh my God! DNC! DNC is doing it! Ay, nako! What are you doing? Bakit ka nag-divide? Why did you do it? My friend! OG! Nakita mo na, Papi! DNC!
This was likely the single biggest upset in Dota 2 history. Not a single living soul would have predicted double major champions OG to be knocked out by a ragtag team of mad Pinoys. As insane as this was, to reach their new opponents, Digital Chaos had to first fight their way through LGD Gaming. They did so with some difficulties, rebuilding their groove that Wings had shattered. Then came their match against TNC. While TNC certainly put up a good battle, it felt like the lightning that had enabled their victory against OG was all used up. DC took it 2-1 in a bittersweet victory. And now that they had knocked out the crowd favorites, they had to carry that crown. Their next challengers were eHome, who had placed first in their group and only just lost to EG. This is where Digital Chaos's journey should have ended yet again. But that lightning had chosen its new champion. In yet another miracle upset, relying on their signature Timbersaw, Digital Chaos knocked out eHome. Next came Fnatic, who had started in round 1 of the lower bracket and beaten Escape Gaming, Alliance, Team Liquid and MVP Phoenix to make it here. TI6 was the year of the dark horses, the year of surprise runs. The year of runs ended by Digital Chaos, who took down Fnatic and got ready for their destined opponents. Digital Chaos were a North American team, ranked second in the region. First were undeniably and undisputably evil geniuses. What followed was an incredible series of matches that I wholeheartedly recommend for a rewatch in their entirety. Digital Chaos, the People's Champs, going up against defending TI champions, Evil Geniuses. It took everything DC had, but yet again, they managed to claim victory. And so, After a once-in-a-lifetime run, DC had made their way back for a rematch against Wings. Surely, now they would be taken seriously. The Game 1 draft began, and everything looked normal, until Wings, yet again, picked Budge. Even now, in the grand finals of a tournament where the winners take home $9 million, Wings still weren't trying. They lost this game, but then stomped DC across the next 3 matches. The miracle run was over, and Wings Gaming were our new TI champions. The International 6 was a wonderful tournament, one of my absolute favorites. This was also the year where Valve really stepped up their production value and made TI feel like a landmark competition through presentation alone. But its bizarre story didn't end just yet. What I'm about to tell you is something that unfolded over the next couple of months, although the exact specifics of it are fuzzy. A lot of the information regarding Wings' circumstances after TI6 got muddled by overreactions, bad reporting, and mistranslations. Here's my best attempt at interpreting reports from a variety of contradictory sources. Please forgive me if I get something wrong. Chinese Dota was governed by the Association for Chinese Esports, often simply called ACE. ACE controlled all domestic tournaments and determined which teams were and weren't allowed to compete. Despite their victory, the players from Wings Gaming weren't treated well by their organization. Salaries weren't being paid on time, and so the Wings players invoked a clause in their contract to leave their organization and then formed an independent team called Team Random. However, it appeared that there was an additional clause to their contract that the ex-Wings players didn't fully understand, which barred them from joining a new organization even after they left Wings. This led to confusion and eventually resulted in multiple ex-Wings players claiming on social media that they have received lifetime bans from ACE. This would have been a huge deal. While a ban from ACE wouldn't have stopped Team Random from competing at TI or other international tournaments, it would have made it impossible for them to find practice partners within China. Many prominent community members expressed their outrage at this injustice, but as would be revealed later, Team Random hadn't been banned, and this was a misunderstanding. But during this mess, eHome approached Team Random and tried to poach 2 of their players. This would also have broken that existing contract, but unlike ex-Wings, eHome either did so knowingly or at least was in a position where they should have known. In response to this, ACE banned eHome. While all players signed by eHome were still allowed to find a new team to compete under, they couldn't if they stayed with the organization. This was the end of one of the legendary Chinese Dota teams. Just like that, eHome was done. While Valve still gave them an invitation to TI7 qualifiers, their teams couldn't practice within China anymore, and so they never made it to a TI again. From this position, Team Random disbanded. My guess will be that it had all gotten too messy, too difficult, and it just wasn't worth it anymore. For the first time, the next international would not have a defending champion. After the International 6, Underlord was released, who was the last hero that needed to be ported from Warcraft 3 Dota. Dota 2 had reached full parity with its predecessor, and given that, the question on everybody's mind was clear. What now? What happens next? Well, we already knew about the next hero, as Monkey King had been announced during TI6. Also included in his trailer was the name of the next update, The New Journey, and it was promised to release this fall. But in classic Valve habit, September, October and November all came and passed. The community was getting antsy. Then, in early December of 2016, the Boston Major took place, and as that tournament came to a close, another announcement was made.
And now we say goodbye with one final treat. Enjoy.
Valve announced Dota 7.0. The last time Dota had a major version change was in 2005, making this an incredibly meaningful symbolic moment. Valve was telling us that Dota 2 was about to change dramatically. In my opinion, Dota 7.0 marked the end of the second distinct era of Dota 2 and the beginning of the third. This second era was one defined by transition and self-reflection, a perfect starting point for innovation. Dota 7.0 was released only 2 days after its announcement. Valve had not overpromised. The map was hugely adjusted, adding new creep camps, new paths, and new spawn locations for bounty runes. This introduced a ton of extra gold to the game, which Valve initially compensated for by lowering the respawn frequency of jungle camps. Instead of respawning every minute, that interval was doubled. This turned out to be overkill, as the jungle often felt empty in a frustrating way, and so the jungle timings were quickly reverted. Heroes also gained a backpack, 3 additional inventory spots where items could be stored but not actively used. This was great for supports, as they used the backpack to transport wards and consumables without needing to sacrifice inventory space. But every hero benefited from the backpack, as they could always use it to store their TP scrolls. However, undoubtedly the biggest change was the addition of talents. Every hero gained 4 sets of 2 talents, out of which they would get to choose one when they reached levels 10, 15, 20 and 25. These talents became progressively more powerful. Level 10 talents were often simple stat boosts, while level 25 talents were simple stat boosts that could end the game. Okay, I'm joking right now, but there's some truth to that. While most heroes received at least a few ability-specific talents, the vast majority of talents were generic, providing a variety of stat boosts that could apply to every hero. Amongst those were quite a few silly ideas. Queen of Pain, for example, gained 70% spell lifesteal at level 25, an amount so absurdly high that it became nearly impossible to kill her should she ever reach that point. Another interesting one was Puck's plus 300 GPM talent at level 25, which would quickly get buffed to plus 420 GPM, which was funny. As you might expect, this first set of talents had some balancing problems, which would need to be ironed out over the next couple of months. There's one build I would like to highlight in particular, but before we do that, let's finish up 7.0. In addition to talents, the leveling structure for heroes was reworked. Before, they would gain their ultimates at levels 6, 11 and 16. Now that was extended to 6, 12 and 18. However, this didn't require additional experience, as heroes leveled up quicker than before. 7.0 was Dota's second major rework, and it was received with huge enthusiasm from the community. That was until they started playing against the final inclusion of 7.0, Monkey King. I think it's fair to say that apart from unintentional bugs, Release Monkey King was the strongest hero to ever exist in Dota 2. He had an incredibly powerful AoE critical strike that also stunned for a long time, could build up enormous damage with his passive and then carry that damage for as long as he wanted to, and his ultimate summoned an army of copies of himself, each of which constantly attacked nearby enemies with a damage-enhanced hit that could trigger attack modifiers like Echo Saber and Skull Basher. While Echo Saber wouldn't result in a double hit, it still applied its slow and did so on every single attack. And Skull Basher could trigger independently for each soldier, turning his ultimate into a zone of guaranteed death. Monkey King was hilariously overpowered, and so over the next couple of months, he was nerfed so many times that he unfortunately didn't have much of a presence at TI7, but Monkey King would find his home in the competitive scene eventually, although surprisingly most often as a support. Now allow us to briefly return to talents. Among the early talents, there were 3 that were a bit different from the others. Those were bonus gold per minute talents, bonus experience gain talents, and respawn time reduction talents. While the first 2 were a bit strange but mostly fine, the last ended up causing huge problems. The most powerful thing a Dota hero can be is alive. Even if a hero wasn't as powerful as the opposing side, if that hero simply kept reviving, then it was incredibly difficult to break through them. I think the best example of this was the short-lived bearless Lone Druid that became popular during this era. This build was centered entirely around Lone Druid's talents. At level 10, he gained plus 200 attack range, and at level 15, plus 65 damage. These were good talents by themselves, but Lone Druid was a hero designed around his powerful Spirit Bear summon, meaning they were a bit misplaced on him. If he chose them, then he became a reasonably dangerous ranged attacker, but most of his spells went completely neglected. He basically became a really bad sniper. However, at level 20, Lone Druid gained a minus 50 seconds respawn time talent. Usually at level 20, heroes would take 74 seconds to respawn, meaning Lone Druid came back after only 24 seconds of death. Even if Lone Druid died in a fight, he could join another right away and sometimes would even respawn in time to continue the fight he previously lost. Heroes with strong respawn talents felt like they were constantly buying back, except for free and without a cooldown. This very Lone Druid build only existed for a single major before getting nerfed, and the entire concept of respawn talents was removed in May of 2017. Adjusting talents was really the bulk of the work Valve did during this half year. While a few broken ones had to be nerfed, most heroes received new ones or had their existing ones buffed. Overall, that was the general trend for years to come, as talents will continue to be made hero-specific and more powerful. The same applied to heroes in general. Every time a major patch was released, the collective power level went up a little bit, as more characters were buffed than nerfed. 7.06 also made Roshan more valuable, as he started dropping cheese from his second death onwards as opposed to the third. And Denies now gave 30% of the experience of the denied creep to the denier, rewarding teams for controlling and maintaining a lane, but denied creeps also gave more experience to the opposing team, making staying in such a lane more palatable. The International 7 was a wonderful tournament. Talents and the other balance adjustments and reworks heroes had received made for the most balanced competition yet, as a huge number of characters saw frequent and effective use. The increased resources and faster levels resulted in a bigger emphasis on traditional carries, but at the same time, there were enough powerful disablers viable to properly manage such dangerous threats. Laning creativity saw a peak like it never had before and it never would again. Teams played duo side lanes, tri-lanes, dual mids, jungling strats and roaming supports all in the same meta. Even Lycan-led pushing teams made a return. The meta was so wonderfully open to different timings because of the varying peaks introduced by talents. Some heroes used them for early tempo plays, while others tried to rush their level 25. My favorite amongst those was Venomancer, a hero that hadn't seen noteworthy play since TI2. He had received two powerful talents in 7.0. The first was a level 10 plus 30% experience gain talent, which he used to rush level 25 as quickly as possible to then unlock his 3 times Plague Ward HP and damage talent. Usually, Venomancer's Plague Wards were more of a nuisance, a scouting tool that applied some minor damage. But with his level 25 talent, they suddenly turned into tiny towers that Venomancer could summon at a whim. This was very funny, but also very effective. The top heroes by pick rate were Night Stalker, Batrider and Nyx Assassin, all of which were characters that kept other heroes in check, as opposed to being particularly overwhelming themselves. This was another sign of a healthy meta, as managing threats was more realistic than trying to get rid of all the strong ones. Although it's worth pointing out that Nyx Assassin managed an above 71% win rate despite being in over 78% of the competition, so maybe he was the real threat all along. Either way, the International 7 had an incredibly diverse meta with a deep hero pool and a broad selection of viable strategies. Even the tournament format was improved, as an additional 2 teams joined the competition, but the 2 lowest performing teams were already eliminated during the group stage. To me, this made the group stage even more exciting, especially when considering how unbelievably stacked this tournament was. Everybody was playing incredibly well, and there were no clear favorites to take it. This environment created the perfect storm for what I consider to be the greatest run of all time of any team of any TI. Team Liquid won their groups, but then came just short of winning their upper bracket round 1 match against IG. They fell to the lower bracket and then beat, in order, Team Secret, Team Empire, Virtus Pro, LGD Gaming, LGD Forever Young, and Newbie to take the entire tournament. With each opponent they beat, Team Liquid became better and better. They didn't start as the strongest team, but as they took the grand finals in a 3-0 sweep, they had clearly turned into the best team in the world. The International 7 is my favorite international. The greatest meta, the most exciting teams, and an amazing production. It's perfect. My only wish is that I could go back and experience it for the first time yet again. If you haven't seen the International 7, then do yourself a favor and set aside the time. However, there's arguably one blemish tarnishing TI7's perfection. At TI7, Valve announced Artifact. Artifact was to be the Dota 2 card game, designed by none other than Richard Garfield, the original designer of Magic: The Gathering. For what it's worth, I was very excited for this game, but the general audience was a bit more reserved. This story actually plays out after the International 8, but I don't want to have to bring up Artifact again, so let's just tackle this now. Artifact was released on the 28th of November 2018. However, a large number of players got access to the game a week early, which meant that that's when the hype cycle of the game was supposed to start. But for some inexplicable reason, Valve also released Dota patch 7.20 at the same time. 7.20 was a huge patch and took all of the attention from the Dota player base, drowning out Artifact's release from the very beginning. This was arguably a blessing in disguise, because as players started trying the game, its horrible monetization model became visible. Artifact was a paid game, in which you had to buy packs to get cards, and then buy tickets to play ranked matches. Players joked that Artifact was pay to pay to pay to play, but I think that was just true. Artifact also wasn't very fun to play, as it felt like a casual board game that was trying really hard to be a competitive collectible card game. Valve even promised that there would be a $1 million tournament for Artifact. But the game was filled with incredibly impactful random elements that could invalidate the most carefully laid out strategy, which made it poorly suited for competitive play. And so Valve never hosted that tournament. Artifact's game design felt like it was being held together by tape and sticks, as it was full of cards that tried to fix these self-inflicted issues, but it just didn't work. Aside from these two issues, Artifact was incredibly well made, with wonderful aesthetics, voice acting, and sound design, but ultimately, the most important pieces were all wrong, and so none of that mattered. It peaked at 60,000 concurrent players shortly after release, but 2 months later that had already been reduced to less than 7,000, another 2 months after that to around 800, and it declined from there. I have never seen a major game release die as quickly as Artifact did. And it didn't deserve better. Valve eventually made an attempt to redesign Artifact, but that didn't last particularly long, as there just wasn't any interest. The most lasting legacy it left behind were assets for Dota 2 custom game creators, some lore for the people who care about that, and the Artifact category on Twitch, which is where you can go to watch a variety of illegally streamed movies and TV shows. A real shame, to be honest. I still wish it had been good. But before we move on, a related tangent. As I was writing this video, I discovered something weird that I couldn't find an explanation for, and I'm now including this here in hopes that one of you can tell me what was going on. Artifact has been dead for a while, and it usually has around 20 to 30 concurrent players, 60 on a good day. But on the 9th of July at 5 PM, That number suddenly skyrocketed to 2,531 concurrent players, and it stayed at around 2,500 constantly until a sudden decline on July 10th at noon, where it dropped down to the usual 30, only to immediately rise back up to 2,500 an hour later. Then it stayed at that number for around a week, before dropping to a constant 2,200 for 3 days, after which it returned to its previous normal. This rise in player numbers wasn't only strange because it came out of nowhere, but also because it didn't show any of the usual day and night fluctuation. It's clear that Artifact was being botted. But why? Who would benefit from Artifact having 2,500 players? I don't think it's Valve. I don't see a reason why they would care. I suppose they could have been using it for some internal tests, but that seems unusual and inefficient and a bit careless. When I googled for any possible explanation, I really couldn't find anything, because only a very small number of people even noticed this was happening in the first place. Not a lot of people still care about Artifact. So if you have any ideas, please let me know, because I am dying of curiosity. Okay, tangent done. We return to October 2017. Patch 7.07 releases and brings 2 new heroes, Dark Willow and Pangolier. Because of Monkey King, the community was a bit careful to get too excited about these new characters, but that quickly faded as we started playing with them. They were mostly balanced and quite a lot of fun. Specifically, Pangolier, in my opinion, was a great addition. Both ended up seeing significant competitive play, Dark Willow immediately and Pangolier in a couple years' time. 7.07 also added 5 new items: Aeon Disc, Kaya, Meteor Hammer, Nullifier, and Spirit Vessel. Each of these saw competitive play, but by far the most impactful was Spirit Vessel, which gave every team access to healing reduction, something that had previously been limited to only Ancient Apparition. On top of that, Poorman's Shield and Iron Talon were removed. Poorman's Shield had always been an overpowered item. Its removal was only a surprise because it felt like it should have happened much sooner. Similarly, Iron Talon had evolved into a monster. When it was originally introduced, it served a very specific purpose, and it achieved its intended goal. But post 7.0, the Dota map had a lot more resources on it, so perfect creep efficiency through stacking wasn't as important anymore. That then made Iron Talon simply an overpowered farming item, and so it was cut from the game. Also included in 7.07 was that Roshan now dropped a refresher shard when killed for the 3rd time, and perks. Perks gave all heroes additional bonuses based on their primary attribute. Strength heroes gained status resistance for each point of strength, agility heroes gained movement speed for their agility, and intelligence heroes magic resistance for their int. It turned out that giving all strength heroes a status resistance just for existing was maybe a bit of a silly idea, and so rather quickly perks were reworked. They started providing magic resistance for strength and spell lamp for intelligence instead, and now all the heroes always gain bonuses for all of their attributes, but the bonuses for their primary attribute were increased by 25%. Perks were more of a flavorful element. Not to say that they didn't have a balanced impact, but players also weren't building specific items to benefit from perks. It was more of an additional benefit every hero got for doing stuff that they already wanted to do. Another noteworthy change was that bounty runes started granting gold to every hero on the team that picked it up. This was more resource creep, giving all the heroes gold that they didn't have before. It also made bounty runes quite valuable and something that teams invested effort into contesting. Similarly, in patch 7.09, stack creep camps started providing a fraction of their bounty to their stacker. The final important inclusion was that lane creeps now gave only 25% experience to the denier, but also only 25% to the denied. This was a huge reduction, cutting denied creep experience to nearly a third of what it had been before. During the season leading up to the International, Valve introduced the Dota Pro Circuit. The DPC consisted of major and minor tournaments chosen and sanctioned by Valve that each awarded points towards the International. Before now, TI invitations were based on internal criteria by Valve. Vibes, if you will. Now they followed a simple point system that was transparent and easy to understand. 8 teams made it through the DPC and then another 10 through open qualifiers. This new system was hugely successful and led to another incredible field of competition. There were no clear favorites and the group stages were closer than they had ever been before. Multiple additional tiebreakers had to be played, and even the 2 teams that were knocked out first didn't leave without a bunch of game wins. The meta of the International 8 resembled the one from the previous year, but was beginning a process of tightening and refinement. Dual lanes top and bottom with a playmaking mid were becoming the dominant style, but other approaches also still existed. Dota would continue to evolve into this direction, because as more and more resources became available and heroes became increasingly powerful, meaning they could farm those resources quicker, the offlane transformed into a core role. During the early years, offlaners were more akin to supports as they focused on survival, but by 2018 they were expected to apply pressure and have relevant farm themselves. Because of the recent changes to the Nai experience, offlaners also couldn't be passive. They had to be able to fight well on lane to actively pressure their opponents. The 2 most contested heroes of the tournament were Enchantress and Vive, both of which had high early damage output and good survivability. As they played the offlane, they were resilient and dangerous, and they could scale while still impacting the early game. Both put on a fantastic performance, outdoing the next 7 most contested heroes on win rate alone. And then came Broodmother, who was another incredible offlaner with by far the highest win rate of the top characters at 66%. Having a strong offlane was important, and this limited what else could be done on the map. TI8 was still a well-balanced tournament, but definitely more centered around its best heroes than its predecessor. Where TI8 truly impressed in its balance was between the teams. There's not a single series that happened during its main event that I would decidedly call an upset, simply because all the teams were so close to each other in skill level. Everybody was struggling, everybody was fighting hard. Both the upper and lower bracket were bloodbaths, and every team that was knocked out felt like a potential tournament winner gone. Within this brutal environment, Dota's destined champions struggled their way into the upper bracket. OG have been a top competitive team for multiple years now, but always underperformed at the International. Leading up to TI8, they even had a bad season and roster issues, only settling on their final team 2 months before the competition. Anna, who had been taking a break from competitive Dota for 10 months, and Topson, a ladder grinder who had never competed at a major tournament, joined the team. This new OG, instead of being invited like during the previous 2 years, had to fight their way through the qualifiers. Once the tournament started, OG only placed 4th in their group, and now had to face VGJ Storm, the best performing team from the other group. But before this match even started, there was some controversy. As Valve explained on Twitter, VGJ Storm had broken tournament rules by having 2 coaches help during the draft in the group stage. Teams were explicitly told that they would only be allowed 1 coach. As penalty, Valve prohibited VGJ Storm from having any coach help during their draft against OG, and reduced their drafting bonus time from 90 seconds to 20. These were harsh penalties, but if I'm honest, I think Valve were being nice. VGJ Storm clearly broke a major rule, and I believe a disqualification wouldn't have been unfair. Either way, OG managed to win this series without much trouble, and I think it's fair to say that the drafting penalty played a part. Next, OG had to take on Evil Geniuses, who posed a tremendous challenge. Game 1 was close, but then, no-name Topson, playing his now signature invoker, found the perfect opportunities to carry his team to victory. Game 2 was similarly close, but this time, Topson dying on his lonesome led to his team's defeat. Even the most endless stream of buybacks couldn't save OG. Game 3 then was long and difficult. Both teams fought with everything they had, but as things came to a close, Anna showed that a 10-month break had somehow only made him better as he led OG to an incredible victory. They had made their way to the upper bracket finals, and their reward was a fight against PSG LGD, who had been stomping their way through the upper bracket. Game 1, Game 2, both difficult and hard fought. Then, In Game 3, OG tried to play for the late game again. But this time, their opponents were ready for it. At 55 minutes into the game, PSG LGD had broken into OG's base and were sieging the Ancient. OG used everything they had to defend, but as Ana died without buyback, all hope seemed lost. They did manage to also kill PSG's main carry, but if the Dire retreated here and waited for respawns, then there was basically no way for OG to win. But then Terrorblade bought back, and so did Enchantress. PSG LGD wanted to finish this game right now. OG didn't have much, but a chance was created. Thompson then rushed in to draw attention. He wanted PSG LGD to kill him so he could buy back and continue fighting after they had used their abilities. And PSG LGD took the bait. They targeted down Thompson, giving the remaining OG heroes an opportunity to focus on Terrorblade. As his HP dropped lower and lower, OG's Earthshaker respawned, threw out a stun, and then landed a game-ending ultimate to finish off Terrorblade. Because of his buyback, Terrorblade now had a 125-second respawn time, enough for OG to run across the entire map and finish the game. OG had, somehow, made it to the Grand Finals. All of OG's struggles were always accompanied by their non-stop chat spam. OG's players were constantly using the chat wheel sound effects, which definitely gave them a unique aura compared to other teams. Some viewers disliked OG because of it, as they viewed it as disrespectful, while others thought it was hilarious and cheered them on. OG later explained that the chat wheel spam was a way to keep them grounded and to de-stress, and they continued doing so for the rest of their career. The following day was Finals Day. PSG LGD took out EG in the lower bracket and returned for a rematch, a match that they were supposed to win, at least according to the prophecy. Remember, ever since the very first international, the West and China have taken turns winning, and the last victory came from Team Liquid, a Western team. It was China's turn, and PSG LGD were Chinese. But you already know what happened. It took 5 hard-fought matches, during which one of the most legendary Dota moments of all time occurred. But OG did it. They won the International 8. They broke the curse. After all these years of being favorites and failing, the first tournament where only few believed in them, they took home the Edges and over $11 million. The International 8 was also a wonderful tournament. While I personally would place it just below TI7, this tournament was just stacked with great matches. I would assume that most of you have already seen the Grand Finals, so my recommendation for a rewatch here will be the upper bracket finals between OG and PSG LGD. At TI8, Valve announced the next 2 Dota heroes, Mars and Grimstroke. Mars was said to be released in winter, but was actually released in March, while Grimstroke was out immediately. These two ended up being the worst performing heroes out of all Dota 2 originals. Grimstroke saw little to no play until he received some major buffs going into TI12, and at least there he ended up being one of the better supports in the game. Mars, on the other hand, saw significant use at both TI10 and TI11, but despite his popularity, his actual results were terrible. Mars has the worst win rate out of any hero, sitting at an awful 32%. This can't even be blamed on a statistical coincidence, because Mars was actually picked quite a lot. The hero just underperformed horribly. Then, later that year, 7.20 was released. 7.20 continued the by now traditional map reworks, opening it up more and more for easier farming. Accentuating that was the addition of a new inventory slot dedicated to TP scrolls. Before this point, they had to be carried in your regular inventory or, at the very least, your backpack. But now, every hero could always have a TP scroll ready whenever they needed it. This was beneficial for supports and carries alike, as both effectively gained an additional inventory spot. 7.20 also introduced additional gold, as denies no longer provided experience to the denier and instead 20% of the gold bounty of the creep. and stack creep camps now provided more free gold to the stacker. While Artifact had been a failure, in January 2019, a different Dota-associated game was released and changed the landscape of video games forever. On January 4th, 2019, Jodo Studio published Dota Auto Chess in the Dota 2 arcade. Dota Auto Chess was a revolutionary game that invented an entire genre from scratch. I understand that this statement might ruffle some feathers, but I stand by it. People will often bring up a Warcraft 3 game called Pokemon Defense to try and discredit Jodo, claiming that they took their ideas from it. But I disagree. I checked out Pokemon Defense and I don't see the most important element that defined Dota Auto Chess. Similarly, Jodo themselves mention Mahjong as a primary inspiration, and while there are certainly stronger connections here, yet again, the most important element is missing. What made Dota Auto Chess special was neither automatic combat or a free set merge, but its innovative shop system. Instead of being given free access to all units, players had to work their way through a limited random selection, which they shared with their 7 opponents. If one player purchased a unit, then that unit became less available for the others. This meant that all players were always impacted by the decisions of everybody else, creating an incredibly dynamic system of endless replayability. Coupled with its fun aesthetic and battle royale style match progression, Dota Auto Chess was an immediate hit. It quickly gathered attention within the Dota 2 community and then also started to attract players from outside its ecosphere. Dota Auto Chess was a genuine worldwide phenomenon. Its player base grew quicker than any game in the arcade ever had, quicker than even that of major game releases. Auto Chess resulted in a noticeable increase in the Dota player base, even though none of the newcomers were actually playing Dota. By mid-March, it reached over 300,000 concurrent players, making it the 4th most played game on all of Steam. Dota Auto Chess took the gaming world by storm, even though all it was a mod. The parallels are obvious. In the same way that Defense of the Ancients All-Stars became incredibly popular and eventually spawned an entire genre of games, Dota Auto Chess couldn't be stopped anymore. Immediately, imitators spawned all over the place. Many of them were, and I don't say this just to be mean, but because I believe this is the best description, unplayable garbage. They were hack jobs thrown together in a hurry to jump on a trend. Dota Auto Chess wasn't a particularly difficult game to copy, as the pieces the players interacted with were easy to implement and a lot of the other elements could be faked without the players noticing. But just because a game is easy to copy doesn't mean there's any value to that copy. Many of the early attempts just made players ask, why play this over the original when the original is more popular and doesn't have to make concessions? Dota 2 was genuinely a great engine for this style of game, and so competing with Dota Auto Chess was quite difficult. But soon, that initial wave of imitators subsided, and a much more competitive horde of challengers approached. The first came right from the source. In February, Valve approached Jodo Studio to collaborate with them on turning Dota Auto Chess into a standalone game, but they couldn't come to an agreement. Both teams decided to give it their own shot, and so, in April, Jodo released Auto Chess for Android and iOS. This version was an exact copy of Dota Auto Chess and even allowed data transfer between the two games. What Jodo's Auto Chess lacked in new innovation was made up for in being exactly what players were already used to and looking for. Valve's attempt came next, as in early June, Valve released Dota Underlords, a slightly iterated version of Dota Auto Chess, but in its own client and with the usual Valve polish. Dota Underlords was an immediate smash success, launching with over 200,000 concurrent players. A lot of that was hype for another Valve game, especially after the failure of Artifact, but unlike there, a significant player count actually stuck around. 2 months later, Underlords was still solidly maintaining over 40,000 concurrent players, which easily made it a top game on Steam. Valve then started hyping up what they called the Big Patch. We didn't know what the Big Patch would be, but Valve insisted that it would be great. However, when they released it in late October, the community wasn't as excited anymore. The big patch introduced a new style of unit called Underlords, which were chosen right at the beginning of the match and were a permanent part of your team. This was a move in the fundamentally wrong direction, because what made auto chess games so interesting was how every match played out differently, based solely on the pieces you were finding. The Underlords undermined this diversity. This could still have been fine, if at least there was a large range of Underlords available, but at launch there were only 2. That just wasn't enough. It then took them another 2 months to add a 3rd Underlord, and a 4th would only come another month after that. But by then, interest was already rapidly dwindling, as Underlords felt like it was moving into the wrong direction, which was made apparent by the other games in the genre that managed to capture the essence of auto chess better. The updates started coming slower and slower with less content in them, until about a year later, Underlords stopped being patched. For Valve, Underlords was just another failure, right after Artifact. But for what it's worth, I think Underlords was, and actually still is, salvageable. I firmly believe that Valve just didn't want to deal with it anymore, and they were a bit burned out by making different Dota games because of Artifact. Unfortunately, my unprompted proposal that I sent to Valve about just giving me Underlords so I could revitalize it was rejected, which was expected but still disappointing. Let's wind the clock back a little bit. Also released in June 2019 was Teamfight Tactics, Riot's attempt at an auto chess. To say it simply, they absolutely nailed it. TFT still flourishes to this day, as Riot fully embraced the core of Dota auto chess while iterating on its issues and understanding which elements shouldn't be changed. TFT is solid proof that Dota auto chess wasn't a fluke, and that this type of game was just really fun when done well. Then, in November 2019, Blizzard joined the party, announcing and showcasing Hearthstone Battlegrounds. Hearthstone Battlegrounds was a new interpretation of the original formula, but like TFT and unlike Underlords, they understood where they could innovate and where they should stick to the basics. Both Teamfight Tactics and Hearthstone Battlegrounds continue to be developed to this very day. Even the original Dota auto chess still exists and has continuously maintained the #1 spot of most played custom game in the Dota 2 arcade. I believe that Dota auto chess was one of the most important things to ever happen in Dota, and that it has permanently changed the landscape of gaming forever. Drodo truly invented a new genre. And I'm so glad that they did. Not only are auto chess games incredibly enjoyable, but it's just so wonderfully fitting that it came from Dota 2. The mod that turned into a standalone game created a mod that turned into standalone games. And auto chess is particularly fantastic for this, because its core system, the shop, can be easily implemented and adapted into a huge range of different projects. Games like SNKRX, Super Autopets and Brotato all pushed into new directions while bringing their own innovations. Auto chess, like Dota, is a genre by the people and for the people, and I hope that one day it'll bring us another surge like this. Okay, let's get back to Dota. Patch 7.21 released in late January 2019 and removed the 25% bonus perks gave to each hero based on their primary attribute. This was a bit of a weird change, because now perks didn't really exist anymore. They were still there, of course, but they were just another thing that attributes did. Valve tried to compensate for this by increasing the primary attribute growth of all heroes by 15%, but really that was just a bit of random power creep. Similarly, Strength started giving 20 health per point instead of 18. May then brought us 7.22, better known as the Aghanim's Scepter patch. This is where every hero that didn't have an Aghanim Scepter upgrade yet received one, and many existing ones were reworked. It also included the addition of our second consumable item, Aghanim's Blessing. Aghanim's Blessing was an upgrade to Aghanim's Scepter, which consumed it and then passively granted the hero their Aghanim Scepter upgrade, but not the stats of the item. Roshan had one of these blessings added into his reward system as well, dropping it with a 50% chance on his 3rd death and as a guarantee from the 4th death onward. Aghanim's Blessing was another way for heroes to scale into the late game, and it wasn't even the only element of power creep of the patch. Starting with 7.22, heroes could have varying amounts of initial attack speed and mana regen, which meant that a whole bunch of heroes now had higher starting attack speed and mana regen. And then finally it was time for the International 9. The International 9 was held in Shanghai, making it the first international outside of North America since 2011. This made sense. It was a little weird that a tournament called the International had been located in roughly the same area for most of its existence, and China had historically been one of Dota's most important regions. Hosting a TI there really felt like it should have happened a long time ago. Like before, the competitors for TI9 were determined by a mixture of DPC-based invites and open qualifiers. However, larger emphasis was placed on the Dota Pro circuit, as 12 teams were invited through it and only 6 joined by winning a regional qualifier. The field was as competitive as always. While most predicted either Vici Gaming or Team Secret to win, as they had performed excellently during the DPC, the doors were wide open for any of the challengers to take it. Even the People's Champs, OG, had returned with their original squad. OG had a lackluster season before TI9, likely in part because Ana took another multi-month-long break. They made it to TI, but only in 10th place. Expectations were low, but once the tournament started, something seemed to click in OG, and they charged into the group stage with spectacular bravado. The International 9 continued Dota's evolution towards enforced dual lanes and individualistic play. Every hero became individually more important, as responsibility for late-game success was divided up among the team. Offlaners in particular were expected to carry a larger share of that load, and this made fighting for and securing a laning success crucial. In that vein, Enchantress continued dominating the competitor scene, as her unique blend of laning prowess and late-game scaling made her easy to fit on a broad selection of teams. Similarly, Shadow Demon and Mirana played fantastic offlane supports, as they could trade hits favorably with their long-range attacks and abilities and threaten kills for even the smallest mistake. Out of the top 5 most contested heroes, 4 were offlane specialists. Once past the laning stage, teams played for map control and tried to stop their opponents from farming. The race to the top became more of a focus as the power ceiling of all the heroes continued moving upwards. But farming wasn't a foolproof strategy yet. Aggressive teams could apply enough pressure to break through a defense and crush a base before their opponents got a chance to properly involve their carries. OG started just running at their opponents. Like complete maniacs, they would unrelentingly charge in, forcing tons and tons of fights and then overwhelming through better play and micro-interactions. At times, OG didn't even feel like a team, but just 5 pub stompers let loose on an innocent unranked lobby. That's not to say that they couldn't play a more coordinated style. When necessary, OG supports reined in their course and created an unbreakable defensive safeguard, ensuring that even when a team managed to stifle their initial assault, OG would still find a path to victory. OG destroyed the group stage, winning 14 out of the 16 games they played. Then they moved into the upper bracket and continued to crush their way through the tournament. OG were clearly and decidedly the best team in the world. Not only was their play incredible, but they also brought us strategic strokes of genius like carry IO and a certain gyrocopter. While OG had been doing whatever it was that was working so well for them, Team Liquid found themselves struggling. The group stage didn't go well for them, meaning they had to enter the main event already in the lower bracket. From here, Liquid began another historic run, climbing their way past many of the tournament favorites until they had somehow made it to the grand finals and stood face to face with OG. No matter who took it, we would have a first. The first repeat champions, as both finalists had taken the edges before. Team Liquid managed to pull a miracle victory in Game 1, as OG got cocky and waited too long on their buybacks after a lost fight, throwing the game. OG then focused and started destroying Liquid in the same way they had everybody else. Game 2 lasted 32 minutes, Game 3 only 23. But in Game 4, Liquid were putting up a much better fight. They drafted an aggressive team themselves and were breaking down towers quickly to prevent OG's carry IO from reaching the stage where it became unbeatable. At only 20 minutes, Liquid were pushing OG's base, frontlining with the monstrous tank that was Bristleback. OG didn't have the power to defend just yet, but they also weren't lacking much. All they had to do was stall for a minute or two. Then Thompson, playing the gyrocopter, showcased his brilliance, his ability to adapt. He purchased a diffuser blade, an item practically never bought on the hero, because it didn't synergize particularly well with his main source of late-game DPS. Thompson realized that late-game DPS wouldn't matter here. He needed to keep his team alive right now, and Diffuser Blade offered an incredibly helpful ability for that. Diffuser Blade made its wearer burn mana on attack. Bristleback was a strength carry that had huge damage output and high defenses, but relied on his spells to maintain momentum. Thompson managed to burn through Bristleback's mana, which drastically limited how Liquid could continue their push. Relying on Thompson, kept alive by his supports, OG managed to stall just long enough for Ana playing the IO to come online, and the rest is history.
On IO, that Spirit Hero damage is there now. Ana gonna join the fray finally.
There we have it, Miracle's mana. It's pretty much entirely gone by Thompson's focus. He'll look towards GH. He's trying to off, but he can't get out. There's no mana. GH, he's dead, and now OG, they have that numbers advantage for this defense. They'll try and change the ball. Thompson, the Rocket Barrage brings Miracle down. Then the Shackle turn around. They're looking for Jarek. Jarek's backing away. Thompson focusing Miracle. Miracle's still out of mana because of this diffusion. Jarek, he's in with the combo. The GA is out. We will fall though. The massive damage is there from Thompson. Miracle's trying to run. Another stick charge pop, but Jarek can shut him off. In fact, Jarek, he's ready to try and look for more. Another cooldown there. The toss back into the combo. Jarek's has the control. They're all getting picked apart as mind control falls. Miracle is surrounded,
and they're all dead.
Able to get this as well. OG, they will hold.
And they're even 12.
When your mana's gone, what do you do? And OG's ready to go back. And again, Jarek's in with the wrap around the combo down onto mind control. The cooldown's there. Liquid out to back off. Again, mind control's mana pretty much got. He's able to pop the stick, get the GA off at least. Can they fight for the duration of it though? They're getting towards Seb. Heals the pop. Seb's back pretty much up to full. Jarek's in with another combo onto We Are stunned up. We Are dead. Miracle's the new focus. The missile followed through. OG pushing Liquid back to the base. Mind control out of mana. Thompson with his diffuser blade picking them apart. Roll fall for GH for Seb. Cuts him down. Chakram. Double kill. They're pushing on OG. Liquid getting forced back to the base as Liquid have nothing. They have nothing to offer, folks.
They're just giving, look at this, they're diving Fountain in TI Finals. They want Kuroki in the Fountain as well. They're gonna get him, they're chasing Miracle as well. Oh my God.
I can't believe this. I can't believe what we're seeing in this game 4. OG, you thought you saw it all in game 2, you thought you saw it all in game 3, then it is gold. OG are your 2-time TI champions. They've done it, folks.
And it would have...
The International 9 was a tournament full of impressive competitors that never stood a chance. OG showed a level of dominance similar to Wings at TI6. In my eyes, their back-to-back victories and the overwhelming performance they showed here makes the original OG squad the greatest Dota team of all time. My rewatch recommendation for this tournament is OG vs Newbie from the upper bracket round 1. This match featured both carry IO and then also regular OG madness. For me, the International 9 closes out the third era of Dota 2, what I like to call the Golden Age. 2017 through 2019 was when Dota was perfect. TI7, TI9, TI8 are my favorite tournaments in that order. From here, we enter modern Dota 2. This era begins with an enormous surge of power creep. That's because, due to the 2020 pandemic, the International 10 was delayed for a year, giving us 2 years of patches before the next tournament. For the sake of keeping this video moving, I'll be condensing the various patches within this time frame a little bit. Across these 2 years, 4 new heroes were released: Void Spirit, Snapfire, Hoodwink, and Dawnbreaker. Each of these heroes got their time to shine at various points, although Snapfire was decidedly the best of the bunch, as she was an incredibly high damage support with very long range, both of which were always desirable qualities to have. Patch 7.23 kicked off the new era. The maximum hero level was increased, now allowing everybody to go up to level 30, and if they did so, then they unlocked both sides of their talent tree. However, going from level 25 to level 30 required a huge amount of experience, almost as much as it took to go from level 1 to level 25. Reaching level 30 was still a real possibility, but only in very long games. Heroes now also began the match with 3 TP scrolls in their inventory. This eased movement between lanes and allowed for faster early game progression, as the starting gold of all heroes had effectively been increased by 50%. Supports especially appreciated this change, but that wasn't all they were gifted. Over the years, both couriers and wards have been made continuously cheaper to lessen the burden on supports, and 7.23 was the final step in that evolution. Each player now started the game with their own individual free courier, which leveled up alongside them without any additional involvement needed, and observer wards were also made completely free. Since every hero always had a courier now, alongside a larger map rework, side shops were removed. I am hereby starting an official petition to bring back side shops. I don't have any balanced reasons for this, I just like them. Shame they're gone. Stout Shield was also reworked from being an item to being a passive component of all melee heroes. Stout Shield was a very cheap early game item that provided a chance to block damage with an increased amount for melee heroes. From the very beginning of Dota 2, Stout Shield had been an essential component of how the laning stage functioned. Melee heroes always bought Stout Shield, because otherwise they would take far too much damage from ranged heroes harassing them and from stray creep attacks. Stout Shield was mandatory. 7.23 then removed Stout Shield. But in turn, all melee heroes gained a 50% chance to block 16 damage whenever they are attacked, which is just what Stout Shield did. This effectively gave every melee hero 200 bonus starting gold and an additional inventory spot during the early game. Finally, and maybe most importantly, arguably the Stout Shield thing matters more, 7.23 added neutral items. Neutral items were items that could be dropped by neutral creeps after a certain amount of in-game time had passed. These items were divided into 5 tiers, with tier 1 items being roughly equivalent to 2 to 300 gold items, while tier 5 items could be more powerful than anything even available in the regular shop. Each tier of neutral items was only available for a limited time frame, with the first being from 5 to 15 minutes and the last after 70 minutes. After a neutral item of a specific tier was found by a team, the next neutral item of that tier would have a half chance of dropping. But there was no limit on how many could drop. If a team got lucky, they could fill up their entire inventories with neutral items. I believe that neutral items were intended to further increase the baseline power level of all heroes. In theory, even if supports couldn't afford buying items, now they would be given a team's neutral items to ensure that they still felt relevant in fights. But in practice, core heroes simply hoarded all neutral items they could get their grubby little hands on, giving them free rein to greedily rush farming or late game items. Neutral items would receive a large number of adjustments over the next 2 years, and instead of splitting up the information, let's just tackle it all now. Within literally a single day, neutral items were changed to now have a guaranteed 3 drops per tier and no more than that. Now supports never got to see any of them until their usefulness had already been largely diminished. 2 months later, this was expanded to 4 per tier, and a new dedicated inventory slot for neutral items was added. Personally, I think this was the worst version of neutral items. Due to the new dedicated inventory space, having a neutral item equipped was always pure upside, because they didn't have to compete with other items for space anymore. This, and there only being 4, meant that usually the position 5 just didn't get one or was a tier behind, which felt really bad. Neutral items existed like that for over a year and a half, until Valve finally relented in 7.30 and made 5 neutral items per tier available. Along the way, the timings for neutral items were also changed, with tier 1 items becoming available from 7 minutes and tier 5 items from 60. While neutral items brought some excitement to farming and eventually helped supports maintain better pace with their core, they also introduced a new problem. Games that went long enough for tier 5 neutral items to come into play were occasionally decided entirely by which neutral items dropped. While all tier 5 neutral items were very powerful, they weren't equally powerful for all heroes. Some were designed for tanks, others for casters, and others for supports. Which neutral items dropped was completely random, so if one team got an amazing item for their carry, but the other team only found caster items but didn't have one, then that could end an otherwise even game. Neutral item randomness became a serious factor that could decide tournament matches. In January 2020, OG announced that the team would, in effect, be disbanding. Ana took another break, Jerax retired, and Seb stepped down. They brought in new players, but didn't get the results they were hoping for. Eventually, Ana returned and then retired, and finally both Topson and No-Tail also took a break from the competitive scene. OG, the organization, continued to exist, and they were quite a strong team, but the original OG squad didn't return to defend their title. Returning to January 2020, over the next 3 patches the map was reworked a few more times. 7.26 then removed perks. Starting with 7.26a and then 7.27, Ioskadi and Shivascard respectively gained healing reduction properties. Keep in mind that with every patch we move past, on average, more heroes and items get buffed than nerfed. The overall power level was always rising, and that included healing properties. Adding more healing reduction became necessary, and it immediately solidified both items to be constants of the competitive scene. 7.28 then added Aghanim's Shard, and a whole array of new items. These new items were mostly upgrades to existing ones, increasing the maximum net worth that any given hero could use. Similarly, Aghanim's Shard was a new consumable item. It cost 1400 gold and could only be purchased after 20 minutes of game time had passed. Aghanim's Shard was instantly consumed when bought and then either permanently upgraded one of the hero's abilities or gave them a new one. It was a smaller version of Aghanim's Scepter. Included in that same patch was an Aghanim's Shard effect for every hero in the game, further increasing their potential power. 7.29 was released in April 2021 and reintroduced Attributes Leveling. Attributes Leveling was an old feature that allowed heroes to gain +2 all stats by delaying leveling up their abilities or by getting it after they had maxed out all of their other spells. It had been replaced by Talents in 7.0, but now Valve brought it back, effectively giving every hero +14 all stats in late game scenarios. This patch also introduced Water Runes, which spawned in the opposite rune spot to wherever the power-up rune spawned during the early game. This made maintaining good health and mana in the mid lane much easier. Even a losing player would usually be able to recover by grabbing the extra rune. Even more free resources were made available to all heroes as TP scrolls started being granted on death. In turn, heroes no longer started with 3 TP scrolls and instead just 1, but the overall resources being given out had still increased. Concluding 7.29 was the addition of Aghanim's Shard into Roshan's reward structure. Now when Roshan was killed for the second time, he would drop an Aghanim's Shard in addition to the cheese. This was quite a silly amount of gold just for killing Roshan, and so patch 7.30 remedied that by moving the cheese to the 3rd Roshan kill and onward. The 2020 to 2022 period of Dota's development was defined by both power and resource creep. It had never been easier to grow strong, and there was now seemingly no limit on how strong any given hero could become. Valve were clearly and deliberately moving the game into a direction where the line between support and carry was starting to become blurry. I think this made sense. Support had always been the least popular role, and the early days of brown boots only endgames were just miserable. For the regular player base, increasing the available resources and easing acquisition of them made for more fun and dynamic games. It's always important to remember that regular public matches and competitive Dota tournaments might as well be two entirely different games. While this worked in favor of regular players, it led to an unfortunate meta once the International 10 finally arrived. The International 10 had to be delayed for a year because of the pandemic, but Valve had already gotten a Battle Pass ready. So they released the Battle Pass in 2020, and then another one in 2021, both of which contributed to the TI-10 prize pool, which then ballooned to an astounding $40 million. However, that wasn't the only consequence of the pandemic. Originally, Valve had planned to host the International 10 in Sweden, but by 2021, the pandemic was still ongoing, and so the Swedish Esports Federation voted against allowing esports events. Valve tried to find a workaround by classifying Dota 2 as an elite sporting event, which is a bit of a stretch, but they were immediately denied. Without a venue, Valve started searching a new one, and they eventually found it in Bucharest, Romania. What happened next, in my opinion, was really shitty of Valve. Because of these issues, TI-10 had to be delayed a little more. Usually TI took place in the summer, but it was scheduled at the new venue for October. October was late enough in the year that COVID rates would be going up again, making hosting large events like TI irresponsible. Despite this, Valve still went on to sell tickets to the tournament. As was entirely predictable, COVID numbers rose in October and Valve couldn't let audiences into the arena, which they announced only 4 days before the event. They refunded the tickets, but of course that didn't undo vacation time, flights and hotels that had already been booked. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and assume that they were just being naive and thought that everything would work out somehow. But clearly that was never going to happen, and I think they should have known better. Valve treated their most dedicated community members pretty badly here. Across the previous 2 years, Dota heroes had become much more powerful, but most of the rewards in the game remained unchanged. Keep in mind that power creep in Dota is by default also resource creep, because more powerful heroes can farm quicker. This left the game in a really awkward spot, because towers didn't reward much gold, and barracks were difficult and risky to kill but hardly worth it. In the past, killing a barracks was impactful because the super creeps that spawned as a result were actually a relevant threat. They forced the team to engage with that lane regularly. However, by 2021, super creeps were hardly more of an issue than regular ones, which meant the main reward for killing barracks became gold. But gold could be farmed elsewhere, so there was no good reason to take the risk of pushing a base unless it was to end the game. The only objective that was worth killing for its reward alone was Roshan. Especially the second Roshan kill was incredibly valuable because of the Aghanim's shard drop. This led to a farming-based meta, where laning was crucially important because both teams were aiming for those first 2 Roshan kills. Winning the laning stage meant momentum that could be leveraged into an early first Roshan kill, which then gave more momentum to win the fight for the second. That second Roshan kill was nearly always contested and frequently felt like a game-deciding fight. Letting the opposing team get the full value of Roshan 2 for free was simply not an option. Teams would prepare specifically for this moment and then use everything they had, including buybacks, to, at the very least, make the fight not be a snowballing moment for their opponents. If it was, then the match could come to a close only minutes later. But if it wasn't, then both teams would often retreat to farming and get ready for Roshan fight number 3. The third Roshan was worth even more, dropping Cheese, his Aegis, and either an Aghanim's Blessing or a Refresher Shard. Coupled with his regular bounty, the third Roshan kill was easily worth 6,000 gold, arguably much more than that. The time leading up to Roshan was one where both teams needed to get ready for those fights, meaning they avoided other confrontations. To be overly simplistic, TI-10 was a cycle of farming Roshan, farming again, Roshan again, on repeat, until one team managed to build enough of a lead to walk into the enemy base and end the game on the spot. The best heroes were either strong laners, good Aghanim shard users, or excellent team fighters. Monkey King was the top pick of the tournament, as he was one of the strongest laning supports who also specialized in scouting, giving his team intel on any early Roshan attempts. Right beneath him came Tiny, who was still a great laner but also one of the best heroes to place the free Aghanim shard on, and he provided the necessary physical damage to take Roshan down efficiently. Tiny was so powerful that entire teams were drafted just to buff him even further, pushing him well beyond the point of reason. The final hero I would like to highlight is Tidehunter. Tidehunter has been part of competitive Dota from the very beginning. He saw frequent play as early as TI1 and has since then always done the exact same thing. He went into the offlane, beat the hell out of whoever was there, and then clicked ultimate in important fights. While these were always desirable qualities, at TI10 the meta fit perfectly for Tidehunter to shine, and so he was the 4th most contested hero overall. The International 10 didn't have a live audience, despite that being the original plan. This left the production in a really awkward spot. They tried to fix the awkward emptiness of the stadium by adding canned applause, but it only made things even more awkward.
All right, well.
Why is it us? Why us? What happened?
That's a short straw for everyone at the end of the day. It's fine here.
Valve also admitted to multiple COVID cases in the later half of the event, and from that point on, all commentators wore masks. I'm not saying that they shouldn't have, they definitely should, but it did make the audio quantifiably worse. TI10 felt like a huge step back in production quality compared to the previous years. Yes, this was because of the pandemic, but I also think Valve did a really poor job of accounting for it. They wanted TI back, without compromise. But reality didn't play along in a very predictable way, and so Valve put on a lackluster event. Still, at least the bracket was exciting. Going into TI10, there was a clear favorite, PSG LGD. Out of the 5 Tier 1 tournaments of 2021, PSG LGD participated in 4, won 2, and placed 2nd and 3rd at the others. They were on an incredible roll, and that persisted at TI10. PSG LGD destroyed their group, only losing a single game, and then repeated that performance in the upper bracket, cruising into the grand finals. In this modern era of Dota, there weren't major differences in strategy anymore. Allow me to explain. When I say that teams were playing the same strategies, then I don't mean that they were picking the same heroes. There was a large amount of hero variety, but they were picking the same roles. The range of Dota strategies had become conceptually smaller, as every team was playing dual lanes, every team was playing Tricore, every team was playing for Roshan. During the Golden Era, there were many different approaches to laning and mid to late game timings. But in the Modern Era, everybody scaled endlessly, and so it was important that those cores were given an opportunity to use that. While many heroes certainly differed in their peak timings, those peaks weren't as distinct and required anymore. Dota strategy had changed from being about large-scale macro decisions to being about smaller moment-to-moment plays. And that's where PSG LGD were amazing. When they played, they were simply better than their opponents. Their laning was sturdier, their Roshan timings were tighter, and their late-game fights were excellent. Let me show you a teamfight that both demonstrates this point, but also showcases something else that changed in Dota. This teamfight happened during Team Secret vs PSG LGD in Game 2 of the upper bracket finals. It all began with both teams competing over Roshan. Neither wanted to fully commit, and so he was just being chipped down. Eventually, PSG LGD decided to see if they could catch Secret off guard, and so they moved away from the pit looking for an opportunity. And, to their luck, they found it, as they managed to catch the opposing main carry Ursa. They killed him as efficiently as they could, but that still gave Secret time to set up for a counter-initiation. Secret wanted to kill Lashok in return, and they managed to get him incredibly low quickly. But then, PSG LGD did a wonderful job at protecting Lashok and guiding him to safety. They didn't lose a single hero in this fight, and now they should have an opportunity to take Roshan. But as soon as Ursa died, he immediately bought back. While PSG LGD kept their heroes alive, That also meant that they were now low on health and mana. Ursa, on the other hand, was fully healed and ready to go. Team Secret then took an uncontested Roshan kill. Over the years, as heroes became richer, buyback became increasingly more frequent and important. Buyback had always been a powerful option to win a teamfight, but due to its high cost, it used to be a decision of desperation. For many years, buyback also had additional drawbacks. But by 2021, gold was abundant, and those drawbacks had been removed. Buyback became not only commonplace, but often mandatory. In the teamfight we are discussing, PSG LGD did a wonderful job protecting their Lashak, but they probably shouldn't have. The correct play was likely to let him die, so he could buy back and help contest Roshan again. Teamfights were no longer 5 versus 5, but often 10 versus 10. And many teams simply didn't want to fight unless they had buybacks ready, which dragged out games as they stalled for either gold or buyback cooldowns. This prevalence of buybacks was also a catalyst for pushing now being the consequence of a fight rather than the reason. Let's have a look at how this game ended. The earlier Roshan fight put Team Secret into a winning position, and they tried to leverage that into a base push. However, PSG LGD's endless barrage of long-range spells kept them at bay. Getting impatient, Secret made a huge mistake.
And Bane, I mean, he's up in 15 anyway, doesn't even have to expend the buyback. Gale Force just forcing them back. Oh, wait. All right, they jump in, but they're just immediately retreating here. Matu can't make up his mind, going for the LC now. Gets forced out again. Matu is going to find the kill, but that's a buyback now for him. Matu able to Urshot to the other side of the splitter. On the both the way out! Boundless strike! What a god! Jin Q and company just decimating Secret now. Over-aggressive without the buybacks to work.
They lined themselves up perfectly to get demolished by Elder Titan's ultimate. PSG LGD then ran across the entire map from their own base and started breaking down Secret's mid-barracks, and were sure to move on to the Ancient. Buybacks followed from all of Secret's cores, but Ursa's was a bit delayed because his was still on cooldown. These scattered buybacks weren't enough, as PSG LGD's excellent coordination enabled their Monkey King to kill Team Secret a second time. Secret lost this game because they wanted too much too quickly. They should have waited for another Roshan kill, they should never have fought PSG LGD in their base, and they should have waited for Ursa to have buyback ready again. Patience was a critically important part of TI-10's metagame, and PSG LGD excelled at it. Even though PSG LGD had crushed their group, there were 3 other incredibly competitive teams in it that each ended up with the exact same win-loss ratio. Team Secret, who made it all the way to the upper bracket finals and then lost to PSG LGD, Vici Gaming, who ran into Virtus.pro early, were knocked into the lower bracket and then were eliminated by IG in round 4, and Team Spirit, who also lost to IG but in the upper bracket round 1. Team Spirit was both a new and old team. The organization had been around for a long time, but never had a steady team of players or saw significant success. By late 2020, all of Team Spirit's players had quit, and so they searched for new talent. They then signed Yellow Submarine, which was an unsponsored team that had gone through a similar story. It started in early 2015 and then never found the right players until it basically collapsed. In 2020 then, they reformed with new players and put up some decent results. Once Yellow Submarine joined Team Spirit, they started improving quickly. They placed 7th at the ANA Major, then 5th at ESL 1 Fall 2021, and finally 2nd at the OGA Dota Pit Invitational. Along the way, they also won the Eastern European qualifier to make it to the International 10. Team Spirit were undeniably a strong team, but they weren't anybody's favorites to win. So when they started tearing their way through the lower bracket, even knocking out OG, the world was stunned. Team Spirit developed a mastery of the meta. They knew exactly which fights were worth taking and how to set up their carries to be ready for those crucial Roshan clashes. In particular, Team Spirit loved picking Magnus for Collapse, who, I believe, showcased the single best performance of that hero of all time. There was nowhere safe on the map while Collapse was playing Magnus, as he would quickly blink on top of his target and then move them out of position with a Horn Toss Skewer combo. Most teams first banned Magnus against Team Spirit as a result, but he wasn't the only problem. Yatoro, Team Spirit's carry player, was seemingly proficient on all carries in the game, giving Team Spirit perfect counterpick potential. Yatoro played an astounding 14 different heroes across the main event, and he crushed with all of them getting multiple rampages. And then there were Bane and Winter Wyvern, who Team Spirit had been picking constantly for Miposhka, the Spirits for Toronto Tokyo, and whatever else was needed for Mira. Team Spirit were stacked with both flexibility and insurmountable threats. They fought their way to the grand finals, and then, in a long and difficult series, won the International 10. TA10 was an interesting tournament, but I have to admit that it's my least favorite. I would always dread TI10 during my research of these videos, as the meta was so rigid and grindy that the games feel tedious and repetitive. I'm not saying that it's a bad tournament. Every single TI is a top-tier esports competition. But for that exact reason, I find it difficult to recommend rewatching TI10, as you could spend that time rewatching any of the other tournaments instead. If you so insist though, then I would recommend Game 1 between Secret and PSG LGD during the upper bracket finals, as it at least has a very fun ending. Shortly after TI10, the next new hero was released. Marcy. Even at a first glance, Marcy was a bit of a strange character. Dota heroes are usually large in design, with many different elements that can then be customized via cosmetics. But Marcy was just a human. This difference in visual design came because Marcy was, technically, a crossover character from the Dota 2 anime. Across 2021 and 2022, Valve, alongside Studio Mir, released Dota Dragon's Blood, an animated TV show about Dota 2. It was widely received as fine. Slant Magazine's review read that for the most part the show loses itself in inaccessible esoterica, giving it 2 out of 4 stars. That same review described Marcy as the most endearing principal character who is mute and therefore spared cringe-inducing dialogue. There was no doubt that Marcy was the most popular character from the show, but she wasn't particularly important within the story of it, which led to some surprise that she was chosen to represent the series. From what I can tell, the Dota anime didn't leave much of a cultural footprint, especially not when compared to Riot's similar and simultaneously released project, Arcane. But her origin explains why Marcy's visual design was much simpler than that of regular Dota heroes, because she was originally created for 2D animation. Personally, I actually really like Marcy's look. Having one normal human in a world of bizarre monsters makes her quite distinct, and in an odd way, the weirdest of them all. But I wouldn't want more characters like her. I think just having Marcy is totally fine. Dota's next hero, after Marcy, would also first premiere somewhere that wasn't the regular game. Aghanim's Labyrinth was an officially supported Dota 2 roguelike dungeon crawler, first released in the summer of 2020. It was an incredibly popular game mode that was beloved by everybody. Aghanim's Labyrinth was sick. And so, in winter 2021, Valve released a sequel called Aghanim's Labyrinth: The Continuum Conundrum, which was even better and yet again universally beloved. The final boss of Aghanim's Labyrinth 2 was Primal Beast, who would soon be announced to be Dota 2's newest hero. If you will indulge me for a moment, I love Primal Beast, this guy is the best. My favorite heroes are big bulky brawlers that just go in and fight endlessly, and that was exactly what Primal Beast was all about. Funnily enough, Marcy played in much the same way, although she was more of a support while Primal Beast was usually a core. Either way, both these characters were fantastic additions to the game. The patch that introduced Primal Beast was 7.31. 7.31 is a very interesting patch to me, because it seemed like Valve realized just how much they power crept Dota, and we are trying to address that. It's important to realize that all of these changes we are looking at one after another happened incrementally over a long period of time, with months in between, making it more difficult to see what was happening. In patch 7.31, Valve hugely buffed all jungle creeps, giving them increased stats, new abilities, and having them scale across matches. This made jungling at all stages just a tad bit slower. 7.31 also made Aghanim's shard purchasable 5 minutes earlier and introduced a set of new items: Revenant's Brooch, Wraith Pact, and Boots of Bearing. Boots of Bearing were by far the strongest of the patch, as they offered a powerful upgrade to already useful items that came at little opportunity cost. The other two items were a bit more lacking. It would take a few years and reworks for Revenant's Brooch to find its place, and Wraith Pact was just a tad weaker than it needed to be. However, across the next few patches, Wraith Pact was buffed repeatedly. We're going to come back to this in a bit. Patch 7.32 introduced Flag Bearer creeps. Flag Bearer creeps would spawn in every other regular creep wave after the 2-minute point. They replaced one of the regular melee creeps when doing so and carried most of their normal attributes with a few exceptions. Flag Bearers had an additional 40% magic resistance and an aura that provided free health regeneration to allies in a 700 radius. When killed by a hero, Flag Bearers also offered an additional gold bounty to that hero and their nearby allies. Flag Bearers were an unexpected addition to the game, as creep waves weren't usually subject to change, and their purpose wasn't quite obvious. In my interpretation, Flag Bearers served multiple goals and achieved those quite well. They made the laning stage more dynamic, as players would aggressively compete over the Flag Bearers for the additional gold bounty. This was particularly helpful for supports, as this bonus gold came at no cost to the carries. It could be used by any number of heroes within the radius. And due to their health regeneration aura, they could also be used as starting points of pushes. Not major pushes like we used to see, but smaller ones that applied some early tower pressure, with 2 creep waves stacked by a player carefully managing the creeps and the Flag Bearer healing them. I haven't been mentioning it every time, but just know that nearly every patch included some minor map adjustments, moving things around, trying to find the right space for new elements. It felt a bit restless, a bit unsure as to the exact goal. In September 2022, Valve released the Battle Pass for that year. But there was something weird about it. Unlike previous Battle Passes, this one was split into 2 parts. One was released before the International and contributed to the prize pool as usual, and the other was released after the International concluded, without a revenue split. I believe that Valve were running a test with this Battle Pass. They wanted to see if the revenue split existing made a difference to their sales. At this point, the Battle Pass had become an all-encompassing source of Dota 2 skins. There were hardly any releases outside of the Battle Pass, which was absolutely filled to the brim with all kinds of cool rewards. Like many things in Dota, this didn't happen all of a sudden. It was all part of a slow, gradual evolution. From Valve's perspective, it made sense to ask if giving up 25% of the income was even necessary. I can't definitively prove this. I don't know the sales numbers of the post-TI section of this Battle Pass, but I believe that it turned out that people didn't really care. They bought the Battle Pass for the skins, and contributing to the prize pool wasn't a significant factor. This split Battle Pass is why the prize pool at TI 11 took a major hit, going down to only $19 million. I don't think it's fair to compare this prize pool to TI 10, since that one had a 2-year period of accumulation, but still, this was 15 million less than TI 9. In fact, it was the lowest prize pool since TI 5, and only barely surpassed that one. I'm not telling you this because I think TI needs a $40 million prize pool, but because I have seen lots of people get a bit confused as to why the prize pool dropped. It wasn't because the bubble burst. It was by design. In my opinion, Valve deliberately changed the system so they would get more money and less would go to TI. The International 11 took place in October 2022 in Singapore. Dota has always been huge in Southeast Asia. It was absolutely time for a TI to be held there. The format stayed the same as before, with only one new addition: the Last Chance Qualifier. The Last Chance Qualifier took all second and third place teams from each regional qualifier and had them compete in a proper tournament with a group stage and a full bracket. The top 2 teams would then move on to participate in TI, expanding the total number of teams from 18 to 20. This qualifier alone took 5 days to complete and was won by Team Secret and Team Liquid, both of which surprisingly hadn't made it into the tournament before then. As the tournament began, PSG LGD were yet again the clear favorites. They had dominated the DPC, qualifying for TI with a huge point lead over second place. But once the tournament began, they couldn't really find their footing and only placed third in their group. In round 1 of the upper bracket, they then went up against last chance qualifier winner Team Secret, who had been having a phenomenal tournament. PSG LGD were knocked into the lower bracket, where they only lasted 2 rounds before getting eliminated. Previous champions Team Spirit were doing even worse. They didn't even make it into the upper bracket and were then eliminated in round 1 of the main event. With the favorites underperforming, the field was wide open. Thunder Awaken was the first South American team to make it into the upper bracket of a TI, where they upset Group A top performers Evil Geniuses. Unfortunately for them, they then ran into Team Secret in the upper bracket and Team Liquid in the lower. Thunder Awaken placed 5th overall, the highest any South American team ever had. It was a great year for South America, as Beast Coast, a team from Peru, went on to face EG in the lower bracket and, in another stunning upset, knocked them out. Beast Coast then fell as they were overwhelmed by PSG LGD, but the way South America took out the most legendary North American team was iconic. Both of the last chance qualifier teams also pulled incredible runs through the tournament. Team Secret moving through the upper bracket, while Team Liquid did their almost traditional lower bracket run. They seemed unstoppable. That was until Team Secret went up against Tundra Esports. At the International 11, nobody understood the meta better than Tundra Esports. During the previous tournament, Roshan had been incredibly important, not only because of the value of his rewards, but also because of their timings. Aghanim's shard was only purchasable at 20 minutes, which meant that in fast games it was possible to get the Roshan shard before the regular one would be available in the shop, and even in regular matches it wouldn't be far apart. Heroes that relied on the shard could incorporate these timings into their game plan. But now Aghanim's shard was available to purchase at 15 minutes, which meant that the heroes that really wanted a shard would often already have bought it by the time of the second Roshan fight. Roshan was still a high reward objective, but his timings weren't as efficient anymore, making killing him less of a priority. Roshan fights had also gotten much more difficult to win because of Wraith Pact. Wraith Pact was an upgrade to Vladimir's offering that could summon a totem which applied an aura to nearby enemies that reduced their damage by 30% while also dealing 30 damage to them every second. The damage dealt was not the important part here, although it was quite effective at cancelling blink daggers. Wraith Pact was incredibly impactful because of its damage reduction, which severely limited the DPS of many heroes. Usually, the best play against Wraith Pact was to run away from it, as the totem only moved very slowly, and fighting while affected by it was too much of a deficit to overcome. But in the Roshan fight, both teams were clashing over a mostly static objective, meaning that they had to engage with each other's Wraith Pacts. This item was so impactful on these fights and had such an easy build-up with good other utility that nearly every team purchased one. There's not been an item as game-defining as Wraith Pact since Iron Talon. Wraith Pact was so powerful that it made sense to structure entire teams around it, and that then shaped which heroes were popular. Rigidly static heroes like Enigma, Undying or Shadow Fiend could hold their ground and fight next to their team's totem with insurmountable power. And bursty, fast mobility heroes like Marcy, Primal Beast and Pangolier could start fights or disengage them as they pleased, allowing them to play around Wraith Pact's zone of influence. Also popular were long-range characters like Beastmaster and Sniper, who could outrange the totem, or summoners like Broodmother and Visage, who could quickly kill it. No matter the draft, Wraith Pact always had to be considered. That's not to say that Wraith Pact was bought in every single game, since sometimes both teams would draft around it and then it wasn't particularly good, or occasionally teams wanted to rely on Helm of the Overlord, which was also a Vladimir's upgrade and so didn't stack with Wraith Pact. But even in the matches where it wasn't purchased, it still held influence as it shaped the meta of the entire tournament. The laning stage was still crucially important, as a dominant laning victory meant an early Wraith Pact or Helm of the Overlord, which enabled further plays. But in even matches, teams often found themselves without much to do. They were farming, but pushing towers wasn't worth much aside from killing tier 1s to open up more farming space. And Roshan offered good rewards, but was risky to try. Both sides would frequently just move in a loose group, close enough to each other to be ready for a fight, but far enough apart to not obstruct the main carry's farm. These clusters then searched for an opportunity to catch their opponents off guard, poking at them whenever spotted. Once a team managed to break this neutral state, fights occurred in seemingly random places on the map, with no traditional objectives in sight. The end goal was to build a lead so massive that bases didn't even have to be pushed to know who was victorious. It wasn't unusual for teams to GG out without losing a single barracks. Breaking these stalemates and understanding when fights were worth taking was the most important skill a team could have, and nobody was better at it than Team Tundra. There wasn't a secret to their incredible performance. They weren't the kind of team to win with surprise strategies. Tundra simply played the exact meta with unmatched efficiency, frequently relying on the same handful of heroes, and beat their opponents through raw skill and patience. Tundra never took any risks, always playing to maximize their odds in the long run. They placed first in their group and then calmly worked their way through the upper bracket, only losing a single game to Team Secret in the upper bracket finals. Team Secret then went on to win against Team Liquid in the lower bracket finals before getting 3-0 by Tundra in Grands. Team Tundra was our TI-11 champion, which actually brought us another 2-time TI winner. Aoi 2000 had won TI-5 on Evil Geniuses and was the coach for Tundra at TI-11, making him our 6th 2-time TI champion and the only person outside of OG to win the tournament twice. Second and third place went to the two wildcard qualifier teams, Secret and Liquid, proving the value of having opportunities for open bracket teams. Overall, I think TI-11 was okay. The meta wasn't as repetitive as the previous one, but it clearly suffered from some balance issues, and the champion team was just a tad too good and a tad too patient, which made their matches a bit, dare I say it, a bit boring. But Team Liquid and Team Secret put on a great show, and the series between the two is my clear recommendation for a rewatch. Thunder Awaken vs Team Liquid was also fantastic and is definitely worthy of your time. And to close out this tournament, let me tell you about something funny that happened during round 1 of the main event. Royal never give up were scheduled to play against Entity, but unfortunately, 4 of their players had caught COVID. This sucked, but Valve gave them permission to play from their hotel room instead. X-Nova, however, their only remaining player that wasn't sick, played in the arena. And just look at what happened next.
Please make some noise for X-Nova coming out to the stage. He needs your support because, yes, they've had a hard time, but they're not out of it yet. This is their lower bracket best of 1 to stay in the tournament, and unfortunately, the team has been hit by COVID.
Dota 2's next major patch was 7.33, released in April 2023. This patch addressed so many of the issues that had plagued the previous 2 tournaments that it seemed like Valve finally found a direction they wanted to take Dota into. This is our 3rd big Dota rework patch. It started with a massive map size increase of about 40%. This gave Valve enough space to fit new objectives, which they did by adding Watchers, Lotus Pools, Wisdom Runes, and Tormentors. Watchers were tiny, pre-placed wards that could be activated by either team at any time by channeling on them. Lotus Pools were next to the side lanes and spawned consumable healing items every few minutes, which could be collected by channeling on them. Wisdom Runes spawned every 7 minutes and were placed next to both teams' bases. When picked up, they provided a large amount of experience. They would soon be buffed to also provide the same experience to the lowest level hero on the team of the hero that picked it up. Tormentors were placed next to the Wisdom Runes, spawning at the 20-minute mark and every 10 minutes after they were killed. When a Tormentor was killed, they granted an Aghanim shard to one of the 2 lowest net worth heroes on the team that killed it. This selection was done at random. They also gave out a gold bounty. Tormentors took over as the objective that handed out a free Aghanim shard, and so Roshan stopped dropping his. Roshan also had his pit split and moved into both corners of the map. Instead of always being in the same place, Roshan now alternated between the 2 pits depending on the day and night cycle. He was also made more difficult to kill. Next, this patch removed Wraith Pact from Dota. With that, everything that had defined the previous 2 tournaments was gone. What I'm about to say is quite a bit of conjecture, but I believe that if I was writing this video in a few years from now instead of today, I would be considering TI 10 and 11 another transitionary period similar to TI 5 and 6, which was then fully realized with 7.33. I don't know what the future holds, but I think 7.33 introduced the next era of Dota 2. Continuing on with the changes, the larger map had more space for creeps, and so a whole new outer jungle ring with 12 new creep camps was added. Neutral items were also adjusted to no longer be completely random drops and to instead drop a token that could be activated to choose a neutral item out of 5 randomly selected options. This mostly fixed the issue of super long matches being decided by neutral item RNG, although with some very bad luck it could still happen. A bunch of items were also reworked and a few new ones were added. The most important amongst these was Blood Grenade, which was an early game consumable that could be used to enable aggressive plays and ganks. And of course, 7.33 introduced Universal Heroes. Universal was a new main attribute, similar to Strength, Agility and Intelligence. Well, it really depends how you look at it. You could also interpret it as a lack of a primary attribute. Either way, Universal Heroes gain damage equally from all of their attributes, as opposed to only damage from one. Many existing heroes were turned into Universal and had their attributes adjusted to be lesser and more even across the board. At first, Universal Heroes were a bit weak, as they didn't do much damage and their stats were on the lower end, but then their attribute scaling was buffed, and from that point on, it was clear that Universal was the best primary attribute in the game. Universal Heroes could buy all kinds of utility items and scale their damage aggressively while doing so. This made it really easy for them to be flexible in their builds, and that made them easy to draft. If I may editorialize a little bit, I think the way Valve handled Universal Heroes was a mistake. I don't mean to say that there's anything wrong with the core idea. There were lots of characters that didn't really fit into the Strength, Agility, Intelligence system. Attributes in Dota have always been very helpful for communicating a broad idea of what to expect from a hero without needing to read their abilities. But that didn't work for everybody. For example, Lone Druid, Techies and Invoker were clear outliers as their uniqueness couldn't be captured by this simple classification. Adding Universal as a way to communicate that these characters are special and shouldn't be looked at through the same lens as everybody else makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense to me is that they felt the need to make a plurality of the cast Universal. With Invoker's eventual transition into Universal, Universal had more heroes in it than any other attribute. This is complete nonsense in my eyes. Clockwork, Marcy and Magnus, for example, were fine as strength heroes. They are bulky frontliners that have disables and like to initiate. They do not fail the classification of being a strength hero. Similar examples are that Pangolier was fine as agility and Winter Wyvern as intelligence. He's quick and tries to land some attacks, while she uses mana-intensive spells from the backline. They fit our idea of what agility and intelligence represent. These heroes were seemingly only made universal because Valve felt there should be an even distribution of attributes. I think that was a mistake, as not only does that muddle the classification of all attributes, Universal doesn't really have an identity anymore. It has also been causing balance problems ever since. Universal heroes have just been the best heroes. This would have been a much more manageable issue if instead of having over 30 Universal heroes, there were only like 10. Then those 10 would clearly be isolated for purpose and could be tackled more specifically. But as is, I think 7.33 has done a lot of damage to the distinctness and identity of a lot of heroes, which I think is a shame. 7.34 was released a few months later, which was an adjustment patch, refining 7.33. But then something unusual happened. With only a week remaining before the competition, Valve released 7.34D. This was a pure balance patch, but it's still weird that Valve made such changes this close to the competition. On June 20th, 2023, Valve released a surprising blog post. In it, they detailed how, over time, the Battle Pass had swallowed up most of their development efforts. Let me read you their words. Last year, we started to ask ourselves whether Dota was well served by having this single focal point around which all content delivery was designed. Each step we had taken made sense when considered independently. Any single piece of content would be more valuable when bundled as part of the Battle Pass, so we bundled more and more. This led to a momentous content drop every year, but it also greatly limited our ability to do things that were exciting and valuable for players but didn't fit into the Battle Pass reward line. When we recognized this, we made a deliberate choice earlier this year to run an experiment. To take some of the resources that would normally produce Battle Pass content and instead put them towards more speculative updates, including features and content that couldn't fit into a Battle Pass. While work is still in progress on future updates, the first of these has shipped. New Frontiers and patch 7.33 couldn't have shipped as they did if we were focusing all our efforts on producing Battle Pass content. They then continued to explain that in favor of more updates like 7.33, there wasn't going to be a Battle Pass this year, and instead they would release a small compendium without noteworthy rewards. I believe everything that Valve said in this blog post, but I also think there's something else to it. In 2022, Valve tested what it would be like if less revenue was shared with the TI prize pool. In 2023, they cancelled the Battle Pass. In 2024, they released Crownfall, which is similar to a Battle Pass, but none of its revenue is shared with TI. I doubt that this progression is a coincidence. In my opinion, Valve realized they didn't have to share 25% of their revenue with TI, and so they stopped doing it. When they did, the prize pool plummeted. The International 2023 had a prize pool of only $3.3 million and 2024 of only $2.5 million, as Valve yet again released only a compendium with no relevant benefits. It seems to me that Valve are done supporting TI prize pools. I have no idea what kind of long-term impact this will have on Dota's competitive scene. Because of those enormous prize pools, Tier 1 Dota 2 has always been dominated by TI, and with that gone, who knows how the future will shake out. For the International 12, Valve returned the tournament home, back to Seattle. Like before, 12 teams were invited through the Dota Pro circuit, and 8 fought their way through regional qualifiers. This is where another historic first for Dota happened. Team Secret failed to qualify for the International, meaning, for the first time ever, Puppey wouldn't be playing at TI. Puppey competed at all TIs until now, first as part of Na'Vi and then with Team Secret. His list of accomplishments is unbelievable. He won the first International, came second in 2012, 2013 and 2022, and won a whole range of majors along the way. Puppey was a serious competitive threat for the entirety of Dota 2's history, and so him failing to qualify for an International was important by itself. Nobody else even came close to his longevity, and he was winning tournaments for all of it. In my eyes, Puppey is the greatest individual Dota player of all time. And while we're on this subject, I would like to take a moment for all of us to appreciate LGD Gaming, or PSG LGD as they were known for a little while. This organization was part of competitive Dota since 2012, and they have been a top-tier threat for all of it. They got so close to winning multiple times, and at times even had multiple TI caliber teams. I don't think any other organization had the longevity and success that LGD did. So in my book, they are one of our greatest, even though they never managed to win. Once past the qualifiers, TI12 was trying a variety of new ideas. Instead of hosting the tournament across 2 densely packed weeks, Valve reduced the number of games by splitting teams into 4 groups instead of 2, and then spread those matches across 3 weekends. This made it much easier to watch a larger percentage of games and keep up to date with the tournament, which I think was generally a good thing. Less good was the new tournament structure. After regular round-robin groups, there was a new Phase 2 of best-of-3 matches that decided which teams would start the main event in the upper and which in the lower bracket. This was mostly just a very confusing way of saying that the main event now had all teams start in the upper bracket. This confusion was only made worse because of Valve's presentation. The group stage was branded as the road to the International, which was weird, because it already was the International. Group stages have always been part of the International, and even getting knocked out here earned those teams a share of the prize pool. In every meaningful way, it already was the International, but the name implied differently. The same was true for Phase 2, which really was already part of the main bracket of TI, but somehow was still considered only the road to the International. The following weekend was branded as Playoffs Weekend and officially considered the International, but all it did was continue the bracket that was started last week. Really, all that this tournament was a group stage with a following double elimination bracket, where all teams started on the upper side, but Valve were making it as confusing as they possibly could. Coming into the tournament, there were a couple of favorites. Team Liquid and Gaming Gladiators have been absolutely dominating the season, with only a 10-point gap between them, and the distance to the next team being nearly 500 points. Tundra Esports came in third, and they had recently brought in two-time TI champion Topson to play for them. Then there was Team Spirit, who were positioned at a modest 10th place in terms of points, but they had just won 2 majors back-to-back before TI, making them quite threatening. Of course, there was also the usual Chinese powerhouse LGD Gaming and a new formed team by old-school Chinese pros, Azure Ray. All of these teams performed quite well during the group stage, Team Spirit even going undefeated. But then Phase 2 shook things up a bit, as Tundra Esports were defeated by Nouns and Gaming Gladiators by Talon Esports. Both these teams were from smaller organizations with limited tournament success, making these fairly major upsets. These upsets would continue as Tundra Esports then played Entity in the lower bracket and were knocked out of the tournament. Our defending champions lost in round 1 of the main event, again. The tournament continued from there without any surprises. Everybody was beating who they were supposed to. Then the top teams clashed. Team Spirit took down Team Liquid and LGD Gaming Azure Ray. Team Spirit then confidently beat LGD Gaming in the upper bracket finals to take their seat in Grands. Team Spirit played the dominant style of the International 12. They focused on farming. Their matches were long and careful. 7.33 had introduced a huge number of creep camps and a larger map to make hiding easier. The new objectives were also in risky positions, and contesting them was difficult. Team Spirit, like many others, didn't take chances like that. Playing the huge map for farm was just safer. The offlane fully became a carry role, and so did the mid. Every core was a carry now, and even supports started being drafted for their late game potential. Given this mindset, going high ground and pushing barracks was widely considered foolish. Pushes were only done when the game was already over. The International 12 had the highest average game time out of any international since the very first one, and it would likely have surpassed even that one, if not for the Reaper of TI-12. All the top teams were eventually knocked into the lower bracket, but they would never fight each other again. Gaming Gladiators, who had started the tournament in the lower bracket, were on a killing spree, taking out top-tier team after top-tier team. Team Liquid came first, then Azure Ray, and finally LGD Gaming. They climbed their way through the entire lower bracket to the grand finals, and they did so by employing a completely different core strategy from Team Spirit. The second viable game plan at TI-12 was all about tempo and timings. Teams like Gaming Gladiators played exactly to the predetermined objectives on the map. They picked aggressive heroes that became powerful quickly and then contested the minute 14 Wisdom rune. This would usually give them a kill as well as an experience lead. Ideally, they then leveraged this into a fast Roshan kill, setting up to contest the Tormentor and the minute 21 Wisdom rune. If all of these fights were won, which wasn't unreasonable because each of them contributed power for the next one, then that team had an enormous lead and could end the game on the spot with a traditional base push. Gaming Gladiators killed their opponents before they had a chance to farm. Team Spirit and Gaming Gladiators faced each other in the grand finals. Two competing styles piloted by very different teams. But unfortunately for Gaming Gladiators, Team Spirit were just on another level. Their play was perfect. They even beat GG at their own style in match 1. Gaming Gladiators were completely lost on how to handle Team Spirit, which culminated in one of the most insane drafts I have ever seen in Game 3 of the Grand Finals. A quick reminder, 7.34D was a balance patch that was released only a week before TI-12. Most of the things included in that patch were fine, but two specific changes were nothing short of a disaster. Both Chaos Knight and Spirit Breaker had the damage of their passive against creeps increased. Spirit Breaker could now passively farm creep camps by charging through them as he was ganking, and Chaos Knight healed so much when hitting creeps that dealing harassment damage to him was a futile effort. Both of these heroes were incredibly dominant with absurd win rates. They also paired excellently with Grimstroke, who, due to a soft ability rework, had become one of the best supports. And then there was Dazzle. Dazzle had received a rework that allowed his ultimate to lower the cooldown of his items and abilities, which turned him into a constantly ability and blink dagger spamming threat that was just impossible to deal with. He was contested in over 79% of the tournament with a 72% win rate. Dazzle was just unfair. And in Game 3 of the Grand Finals, Gaming Gladiators let Team Spirit pick Chaos Knight, Grimstroke, Tusk, Dazzle, and Spirit Breaker. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw it. To be fair, all of those heroes combined made for a bit of a slower paced team, which I believe Gaming Gladiators were hoping would create an opening where they could overpower Team Spirit and end the game early. Unfortunately for them, that didn't work. Team Spirit stalled successfully and then showed why those heroes had been so dominant. They took the edges, making them the second team to win 2 internationals. Although, unlike OG, they didn't do so with the exact same lineup, they had one new player. For their win, they earned $1.5 million, a tad less than the $18.2 million from their previous victory. Overall, I think the International 12 was a huge improvement over the previous 2 tournaments, but there were still a lot of slower paced games that were a tad too long for my taste. There also was an actual variety of core game plans, which made the tournament much more exciting. It was also horribly balanced, as the top tier heroes were leagues above everything else, but personally I actually think that can be exciting. The bigger balance issue was the win disparity between the Radiant and the Dire. Due to how the map was laid out, the Radiant jungle and teleporters were much easier to access, resulting in an over 58% win rate for the Radiant. As for rewatch recommendations, I'm gonna say TSM vs Team Tundra Game 1 during the group stage. Feel free, of course, to watch the main event, lots of fun games there, but this was just a match I really enjoyed and I think you would too. The goal of Stories of Dota was to eternalize the early years of Dota 2, to try to prevent them from being washed away by our memories. We've never had intentions of making videos about all heroes, and instead the aim was to make enough videos that all major stories were told. In our opinion, with the videos we have already released and this final one, we have reached that point. I'm a big believer in ending things when the time is right. We managed to tell all that we wanted while maintaining high quality and remaining sane despite the overwhelming workload. I want to give special thanks to Spectral Stats, without whom this channel wouldn't have been possible. I've been making content for Dota 2 for the majority of my life, and it's now time for me to move on. I can't properly express how much this has meant to me, and how glad I am that I was able to make Stories of Dota and leave something behind that, hopefully, has meaning. Over the years, Dota changed a lot. It has changed more than I have. Nonetheless, I am optimistic for its future. Crownfall was a wonderful addition to the game, and 7.35 was bizarre and hilarious. Valve are still invested in Dota 2, and while I don't agree with all of their choices, I think overall they've done a great job at keeping the game moving and alive. Often, people will talk about how Dota is dying. I couldn't disagree more. Dota will never die. It can't. Even if Valve were to shut down the service, some lunatics would somehow pick up the mantle and keep it going forever. Dota is a game from the people and for the people. And Dota players are nothing if not dedicated, sometimes to afford. Friends, stay that way. I wish all of you the best, in Dota and in life. Thank you so much for watching Stories of Dota.
Замахивается хвост. Пошел, должен идти блэкхол. Да, пошел блэкхол. Дабл эдж попадает в бэктрек. Ой-ой-ой, он уходит. Какой бэктрек? Но у него же первого левела бэктрек 10%.
All three backline heroes are. If you want to go on that, you have to come from the back. But then LGD just take your axe and well, while he's busy debating, they're busy fighting. Oh no! PGG Chrono for 430, not gonna cut it, and now they just get melted. GG, they know it's over. LGD will move forward. They're going to the...
Да, Хау жестче реагирует. Свап есть. В крипа Овченовского. Садится. В какого? На базу. Вылезает. Нужно тпшиться, лайфстиллер умирает на базе.
Братиш, ты попадешь. Куроки, видите, начинает уже разглагольствовать.
Wants to, but like we said, he hasn't built any armor, and now has the Vlad's at least finished up, but Ramsey's fairly squishy. Ramsey's
trying to get arrowed here as he stands.
They're throwing everything.
Ramsey's dead. He doesn't have buyback. No one's trying to fight back here as he pumps the BKB. Ame himself also has the BKB ready. Jumps up, and Solo's got his one round. He was AFK.
That might be the game.
And he can't buy back. He just stood there and took FY's arrow to the face.
The drafting panel was concerned that there were no saves in this draft.
I mean,
You know, I really feel like every year Slacks should get to design a Dota hero, and it should be put in and never balanced ever again.
He was talking about his Aghanim's upgrades to heroes, and he had like 20, 30 different.
I remember one actually. There was one with Lycan, I think, the one Lycan axe, and it was if you could bite your allies. Oh, yeah. You could bite your allies, and they would turn into Lycans that you then could control.
Yeah, we outdrafted them in first game, but we managed to lose somehow. Now we tried to lose the draft, so we might win the game, right?
Changing tactics?
Yeah.